Okay, hopefully the stream will be live. I'll actually just take a quick look and see if I've got this up and going. Yep. Mr. Kite. Oh, actually, just says a friend has started watching. All right, well, I've already called you out. Excuse me. Kite, if you can hear this, welcome. Sorry for doing that. Don't feel obligated to reply. It's just really good to see you. So, I had a little confusion. I will be sure to give you a shout out once I have a bit of a pulse. I had a little confusion for myself about whether this was more appropriate to do in the creative or the IRL section. Originally, I was going to leave this for another streaming platform entirely, but somebody had suggested that Twitch might be interested in doing content like this. So my justification for streaming under creative is that what we're going to be doing is some programming. We're going to be doing we're going to be using a programming language called R. And I tend to find, so R, you can use R for a lot of things, but sort of its claim to fame is as a statistical programming language. And it is one of these things I've always wanted to get better at. When I'm at work, I use programs called SAS and Stata, both of which cost money. And one of the things I like about R is that it's free. I've literally, one thing that's really interesting to me, I've never used it in Windows. I've always used it on my Mac, or I've always used it on my Linux partition. And one of the things that I like the most about using a tool like that and the availability of a tool like that is that I can go, and if I'm talking about an economic topic that I find very interesting, and that research, or maybe even some of my own research, if somebody is motivated enough, in principle, they would be able to replicate my results, and they would not need to pay money to do that. Now, of course, you sort of need to understand how these things work, but that also seemed like a really good opportunity for me to learn R, because I haven't made that much progress since the last time I tried to do this. And again, this is just because when I do day-to-day work, I use a different system. So I have a couple of goals in doing this. We're going to learn R together. We're going to do that by doing an applied project, and instead of just trying to do, some project that comes into my head, although that might be interesting to do one day as well. What we're going to do is we're going to try and replicate a paper that I think is very interesting and shouldn't be too challenging. There are some things that I don't know how to do in R that I would like to learn that I know are in this paper. But I also think a very important part in economics is that it's more than just calling a bunch of statistical procedures inside of a black box. So we are going to read the paper, and then when the paper does sort of something we can do in R, we're then going to say, okay, now we're going to try and see if we get the same results inside. So it'll be a little bit of slow going. There are going to be some points where you might be really excited by the programming and we take a while to build up to it. But I think this is a better way for us to learn, because we don't just learn a whole bunch of functions to call. We're calling those functions to a specific end, and that end is going to be to try and come up with a causal statement about how the world works. And obviously, we are at a point where race is coming up in the news a little bit more often, and I thought this was a way that we can maybe, I don't know if this is really a discussion on race, but this is it's about history, which I think is really interesting. It's about the long-term effects of some of these things and what they've done to the world and what they've done to specific regions. And it's a way to sort of give you guys an idea about some of the things that I study and some of the things that I've been interested in. So my hope here is that you guys will be encouraged to maybe try and do an exercise like this yourself. But let's talk with some preliminaries, because I did some installs. So if you want to get R, there's two places you can get it. What I'm going to be using is a special version of R that Microsoft has put out. So Microsoft R open. This is why it took me a while to get started. I went here, I downloaded it. The reason I picked this one is it includes some libraries from Intel to use parallel processing. You can use multiple cores inside of it. So if you want, just click download. It'll give you options in terms of your sort of flavor of OS. If you prefer to use the vanilla version, that's totally fine as well. You download that off of CRAN. And again, similar idea here. The current version is 3.4.1. The Microsoft version is 3.4. So there's a couple of other differences on that, but honestly, I think that's better. If you have questions, ask. I'm not going to go into the particulars about Microsoft R Open, but this is the one I'm running, Microsoft R Open. There we go. So the next thing that you want to do is it's best to use what's called an IDE, an integrated development environment with these sorts of things. The one I'm using is called RStudio. So you can go here, and what you want to do, so RStudio actually produces more than a few sort of R-related things. There's Shiny, which helps with visualizations. Shiny is an R package. They also do things like Ggplot too. What you want to do is just focus on RStudio. You'll go for RStudio Desktop. And again, there's a whole bunch of different options that you have here, but you just want the open source community version, which you can download here. Or you can get a specific installer. So the next thing is, if we're going to replicate a paper, we are going to, we need to find a paper to replicate. In this case, I've chosen one by Nathan Nunn. There's going to be two things that we need to do here. This is a good trick, by the way. So if you guys are interested in something like this, and maybe you haven't gone to university, so my university gives me access to academic journals through the library as an alumni. But perhaps either some of you haven't gone to university or your university doesn't have that policy. Usually, if you're looking to sort of see somebody's papers, you can usually go to their website. So I'll give you guys another example. So if you guys are interested in political topics, you can go under research. So if you want to see, so a good example here, we've got the working papers. So Insurgency and Small War, Estimation of Unobserved Coalition Structures. This was something that was published in the NBER first, as Revise and Resubmit in Econometrica, which is a very well-respected journal. Oh, sure thing, Kite. So this is a chance to sort of see the work in progress. If you want to see things that were already published, I'm blocking somebody. Eyes of Sin, thank you very much for that host. If you want to see sort of the papers that have been published, a lot of academics will actually put those papers on their website, and this is a great way that you can see. So for instance, if I didn't have access to the Quarterly Journal of Economics, I can click on here and I get to see Endogenous Political Institution, which is by these three authors. So we're going to apply the same trick here with Nathan Nunn's paper. And in this case, we will be doing the long-term effects of Africa's slave trades. Now I'm going to open that up in a tab because there's going to be one other point if you guys want to follow along. Again, you download a flavor of R and you download RStudio, which I have open right now, but you're also going to need some data to work with. So a lot of, again, academics are required to report this, but if you take a look, usually on somebody's website, you will see they'll usually have a section which is dedicated to the data for their programs. And in this case, we have the long-term effects of Africa's slave trades. This is another Quarterly Journal of Economics paper. It's a little bit older. I mean, it's 2008, so this is about 9 years old now. But it's a really interesting paper, and I think it's a little hard to tell somebody's like, okay, well, we're going to get like something out of a top economics journal, and we're going to replicate it. It's going to be super easy, guys. I'd be lying to you if I said that. But I think it's sort of there's a bound in terms of the difficulty, and we're going to learn how to push through that together. And of course, the nice thing here is that Mr. Nunn has done all of the hard work for us. We're going to basically just be taking what he has done, and we're going to be basically doing a verification on it, given the data that we have. So, long-term effects of Africa's slave trades. What is this paper about? Can part of Africa's current underdevelopment be explained by its slave trades? To explore this question, I used data from shipping records and historical documents reporting slave ethnicities to construct estimates of the number of slaves exported from each country during Africa's slave trades. I find a robust negative relationship between the number of slaves exported from a country and the current economic performance. To better understand if this relationship is causal, I examine the historical evidence on selection into the slave trades and use instrumental variables. Together, the evidence suggests that the slave trades had an adverse effect on economic development. So there's a lot to unpack inside of that. The basic claim of this paper is that the institution of slavery, taking people from Africa and transplanting them usually in the New World, in the Caribbean, to work on things like sugar plantations and whatnot. That this has had a negative causal effect on their economic development today. So African countries are worse off economically in the present day due to the institution of slavery. And there's a couple of things that people might do to argue against this. I think a lot of people will take it for granted that slavery was bad, but sometimes people will say, well, is this really such a persistent effect? I mean, slavery is no longer here now that we've removed it. Does this explain why there's poor economic performance? Some of these areas have something like malaria. Is that a reason why? There's, basically the question here is, if you want to learn more about the world, you're going to have to try and address some of the alternative hypotheses that might explain the same effects that you're describing. And so, again, whether or not you have a strong prior belief about this, what we want to try and do is to develop a systematic way of looking at this question and bring evidence to bear on this claim. A couple of other terms that I'll unpack here. So when we say a robust negative relationship, so in this case here, robust basically just means is that you've got a few different ways that you've tried to model this relationship, and it's all coming back with the same result. And the negative relationship is that if the number of slaves exported goes up, the economic performance goes down, right? So slavery is leading to reductions in economic performance. And again, current economic performance. Last thing on here is instrumental variables. This is one of the tools in the economist's toolkit to try and address some difficult causal questions. What I think I will try and do is I will explain this when we get to it, because I think this will make a little more sense when we actually do some of the inference. There will be one example that you see which is a little more simple, and then we're going to say, well, can we believe this result? Is there something that we're missing? And then we'll be able to use the instrument. So we will now jump into the paper. Now, as I said at the beginning, there's going to be quite a bit of hello, TrippyTube. There's going to be a bit of reading at the beginning, and the main reason for this is you don't want to just take some data and blindly go in and like push it into a black box and have some estimate pop out. That's not really thinking. That's not thinking very clearly about the issue. But one thing that we can do is we can get the data into. Excuse me, guys. We can get the data into R, and this actually is a little tricky. So there's a couple of things that I installed already. I installed the econometrics package for R, and I installed Ggplot too. I will show you how you can install a package momentarily, but I'm going to do one thing. I should be able to set a working directory. Oh boy. All right, well, we'll start a new R script because I'm going to do some programming. And Well, this is interesting. So I don't normally do it this way, but I've got import from Stata. Preparing data import requires an updated version of the Haven package. Do you want to install this package now? This is one of the reasons why I get an IDE. So let's see if this works. It automatically prompts you. You can also do the command install.packages. But let's do a browse. I made myself a directory already called our files. There we go. Hey, and it gives us a nice preview of this. So this is great. I don't think this was in RStudio when I did it before. So we can actually take a look at the data right now. So what are we working with? So there's an ISO code here. This basically just tells you what the country is. It also has a corresponding country name. So AGO, Angola, BDI, Burundi, so on and so forth. There is Ellen Madison PC GDP 2000. So this is the log per capita GDP. And basically this is just the source where that came from. So there's a couple things that you want to do data-wise. And it might make sense if I do the introduction at the beginning. But basically, GDP per capita is gross domestic product. That's all the goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. And that's divided by the number of people per capita. Similarly, we have got log export area. So this is the natural logarithm. This is a little more complicated to explain, but I'll try and do that when we get to the actual modeling part. So this is the total slave exports. And in this case, it says normalized by the land area. So if a country is bigger, you would expect it to have more slave exports. So the idea here is that it's basically, it's normalized in terms of its geography. So basically per square inch, it's not actually that measure, but like you've got something which is saying that, okay, we've got an amount of GDP per person, and we have slave exports by land area to make things as equal as possible. Finally, we've got the log of total slave exports. And in this case, this is normalized for the historic population. So again, we're trying to make sure that everything's on even footing. We're trying to make sure that we're not saying, well, this country's just bigger overall, and so as a result, it's going to have higher GDP and it's going to have higher slave exports. Now, what's here are what are called indicator variables, sometimes also known as categorical or dichotomous variables. The idea here is this is a little bit of a flag to indicate a certain feature of the country. So colony 0 says not colonized. Colony 1 means that Britain colonized the country. Colony 2 means that France colonized. Then you've got one for Portugal, Belgium, Spain. I don't know what UN is supposed to be. I believe that will be explained in the file, though. I'm a little confused by that, to be honest. It's been a while since I've read this paper, by the way. So then Italy. Absolute latitude. So again, geography is fairly important here. We did talk about some geographic features which might be leading towards economic performance, and so perhaps not surprisingly, we've also got the longitude here. So these are sort of identifiers in terms of where the country is falling. Thank you very much for the host, Jesse Quill. Other geographic features or other sort of things that might affect economic performance that aren't necessarily related to slavery. We've got rain, humidity, temperatures. There's coastline area. So this is, again, another log, and it's coastline divided by land area. So you say, well, what's this for? This is why we read the paper, right? Because, of course, the big thing is when Nathan Nunn was sitting down, it's not like he had all of this stuff available right away. He had to decide what was important for this question. Hey, you're here, Jess. I wasn't sure if you'd be around. We've got some good people here. Eyes of Sin hosted. I don't know if... Hey, there you are, Eyes of Sin. Kite was around for a little bit. I know he had to head out, but it's not bad because he's missing out on a lot of the boring preliminary stuff. This is another indicator for small islands. This one is an indicator for the percent of Islamic population. I believe that is present day. I'll have to double check that. There's one which is a little bit more about its history. So this is legal origin indicator French. There is a difference between the French and British legal systems. Then, of course, there's, that leads us to our other indicator, UK. And then there's also regions. So northern region, southern, western, eastern, and central. So again, this is sort of saying what part of Africa. This is a little bit more, let's say, a little bit more blunt than latitude and longitude. R is a statistical programming language, Tripitude. It's actually maybe even better described as a matrix language. You could use this to replace something like MATLAB if you really wanted. But in this case, it's just, for me, it's a very helpful language in terms of being able to do things like replicate papers without having to spend a lot of money on SAS or Stata or something like that. Although in fairness to SAS, there is this university edition which is available to anyone, and it is free of charge. So then finally, we might be getting in. So again, these ones may not be obvious. And like I said, that is why we read the paper, because it is important to understand why we are including certain things. You can always just throw as many covariates in as you want. You can just try and splatter things up against the wall and then look for those three little stars and say, okay, it's causal. But that's not really being honest about how you do it. And the more you just start throwing things against it, you are guaranteed to generate spurious results at some point. So we've got, these ones might make a little more sense. So we've got the log average gold production, again, per capita, log average oil production per capita, and log average diamond production per capita. So again, we are dividing by the number of people because we want to be normalized. Again, we don't want, like, Canada is a very big country with lots of natural resources. We could have, 50 people mining up a whole lot of gold. And everybody else in this country could be dedicated to, to IT work or something like that. And then we could take, a tiny speck of an island, which has got 2 people on it, and they there's just, huge hunks of gold lying around. Both people just pick it up and sell it. Now, one country has 100% of its population dedicated to gold production, and they're going to generate a certain amount per person. Canada's going to generate a certain amount per person as well. And again, in terms of a measure of the country's total output, as well as, how efficient they are at these things. Again, you want to normalize all of these sorts of things here. So the way that we normally do this in this paper is to do it either by person or by the area. So all of these, you're taking a look at here saying, okay, what is the endowment of natural resources in a country? So again, we're examining modern economic performance. This looks like the sort of thing that might be very important to properly addressing that question. We've got a log of population density in 1400. So again, that's how many sort of people crammed into an area in 1400. These will come up when we talk about the instrumental variables, but this is Atlantic distance, Indian distance, Saharan distance, and Red Sea distance. So I'm going to wait for the introduction to explain what these are. Again, the paper explains what all of this is anyway, but it doesn't hurt to maybe take a quick peek at what we have to work with. Ethnic fractionalization. So this is from another paper, Alesina et al., 2003. So this is a measure of basically how divided a country is between its various ethnic groups. State development. Again, this is another measure from other authors. It looks Geniali and Rayner. I don't know this paper. And then we've got land area, which again, we were sort of talking about normalizing for the land area. So we've included that raw value there. So again, normally if you were going to do a project, you would be responsible for finding all of this yourself. But in this case, they did the hard work for us. And I'm going to change the name of this file. I'm just going to call it stream data. Well, you know what? It's not data about a stream, so we'll call it slave data. Hey, no problem, Kite. We just went over we just kind of went over a high level description of all the variables inside of our project. But the good news here is that you didn't need to do any of that because we're going to read the paper and we're actually going to find out what those specific things were. So I'm going to save my project right here. I might actually just make this available. I'll maybe put this up in like the Discord if we get through it in time. Where's my R? Well, so I got a little bit lucky here in that RStudio gave me the import dataset option. So from Stata, if we didn't have it, all that it is really is just a convenient way of calling this library called Haven. This is assigning, so this is the object we're assigning this data set to called slave_data. The command read DTA comes from Haven. This is the file that we were importing from. And then view slave data that just opens up the data set for us. We don't actually really need to do that. So in this case, I'm going to delete this line just because I kind of want to have this thing run and we'll be able to get our results back. So now we're ready to go back to the paper. And again, we're going to be holding off of the programming for a little while. And we're going to do that in the service of learning about what we're working with. So I'll try and make this a little bit larger. All right, hopefully that's readable to most. Okay, Africa's economic performance in the second half of the 20th century has been poor. One often informal explanation for Africa's underdevelopment is its history of extraction, characterized by two events, the slave trades and colonialism. Byrock 1993, page 8, writes that, quote, there is no doubt that a large number of negative structural features of the process of economic underdevelopment have historical roots going back to European colonization. Manning, 1990, echoes Byrock but focuses on the slave trades, writing, quote, slavery was corruption. It involved theft, bribery, and an exercise of brute force as well as ruses. Slavery thus may be seen as one source of pre-colonial origins for modern corruption. Recent empirical studies suggest that Africa's history can explain part of its current underdevelopment. These studies focus on the link between countries' colonial experience and their current economic development. Greer 1999, Engelbert 2000A, 2000B, Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson 2001. This is a really big paper, 2001, 2002. Actually, I can't remember if it was 2001 or the 2002. But anyways, this is definitely a really important trio in this kind of work. Bertocchi and Canova 2002 and Lang 2004. However, the other important event in Africa's history, its slave trades, has yet to be examined empirically. There are reasons to expect that the slave trades may have at least been as important as official colonial rule for Africa's development. For a period of nearly 500 years, from 1400 to 1900, the African continent simultaneously experienced 4 slave trades. By comparison, official colonial rule lasted from 1885 to about 1960, a total of approximately 75 years. So this is a really great opening for this paper, right? We say, here's how people have thought about this problem before. A lot of people are talking about colonialism and the effect that it will have on the African continent. But consider that the slave trade is lasted for over 5 times as long. And so it seems reasonable that we should examine as to whether or not this is a cause for these problems. Again, it could turn out that you ask this question and it turns out that there was no effect at all. But it seems to me that this is a question that's very interesting, and it's one that, again, based on Nunn's reading, that there's a lot of attention that goes into colonialism, but maybe not as much attention that goes into the slave trade itself. This paper provides the first empirical examination of the importance of Africa's slave trades in shaping subsequent economic development. In doing this, I construct measures of the number of slaves exported from each country in Africa in the century between 1400 and 1900. The estimates are constructed by combining data from ship records on the number of slaves shipped from each African port or region with data from a variety of historical documents that report the ethnic identities of slaves that were shipped from Africa. I find a robust negative relationship between the number of slaves exported from each country and subsequent economic performance. The African countries that are the poorest today are the ones from which the most slaves were taken. So, pretty clear idea here. Again, we said the negative relationship is that the number of slaves exported goes up, modern GDP performance goes down. GDP is the measurement of goods and services produced by a country in a given year. And important question here. It's an interesting question. What was the effect of the slave trade? But do we have data to work on this? And in this particular case, Nathan Nunn went out to as many historical records as he could. It turns out that there are indeed records of the slave trade, that all of the ship's records are around, and he's able to build some estimates in terms of, where people were taken and, where they were shipped. And so he's going to, this is what he's going to use to examine this question. And again, if sometimes the language is that of an academic journal, right? So sometimes, robust negative relationship may not immediately be clear to the uninitiated, but it's nicely summarized in this final sentence. The African countries which are the poorest today are the ones from which the most slaves were taken. Now, here's an important thing. A lot of you have probably heard the old saw, correlation is not causation. And in one sense, it is right. You can have a increase in the number of drownings, and that can coincide with an increase in the number of the quantity of ice cream eaten, let's say in gallons, right? And we can even normalize it, the number of drownings per capita to the gallons of ice cream eaten per capita, and you can see a positive relationship between these two things. And you can even maybe come up with a little story in the back of your head which says, maybe you eat the ice cream and then you go swimming, and then maybe you get like cramps and you're not able to kind of protect yourself, or you just something happens to you, you're a little bit weaker, maybe you're dazed. Maybe you're enjoying your ice cream and you fall into the pool. You'll just twist your mind around trying to explain that relationship. But what is this in reality? Well, it's hot out, right? So if it's hot, you're probably going to go into the pool. You're less likely to drown if you're not in the pool. And if it's hot out, you're also more likely to eat ice cream. Now, there's no causal relationship between the two things. But the one thing that's usually missed out, that line is really insufficient, because a correlation is a really big honking red light saying is like, well, you know what, let's examine this relationship a little bit more. The ice cream drowning example doesn't ring true when you think about it, right? And yet, if I say to you that, did you know that the countries in Africa that are the poorest today are the ones that had the most slaves taken from them? Would you doubt that there's probably something to that, right? It's fairly hard to drown outside a body of water, though I'm sure plenty of people manage it somehow. Yeah, as I said, it's a big world with lots of people, so I would wouldn't put it past enterprising people to prove me wrong on this one. But I think the point is sort of established, right? That we've seen an interesting relationship here. In this case, Nathan Nunn has claimed it. We maybe don't see it at the moment, but that's what the paper is about. And again, I'm not going to tell you, what you do is you don't look for a correlation between two things. You can do that in Excel. You don't need R. You can absolutely get a correlation between two variables. In fact, Google will do that even better for you. You could do correlations on just about everything. But I'll be honest with you. I don't see something that's uncorrelated and then say, oh, you know what? This would be a really good paper topic, right? I usually get interested when I see a correlation. So, what that old saw really should say is more, you have all your work ahead of you once you see the correlation, but you should probably be paying attention at that point. But it doesn't quite have the same pithy ring to it. Anyways, this finding cannot be taken as conclusive evidence that the slave trades caused differences in subsequent economic development. An alternative explanation is that is just as plausible, is that countries that were initially the most economically and socially underdeveloped selected into the slave trades, and these countries continue to be the most underdeveloped today. In other words, the slave trades may be correlated with unobserved country characteristics, resulting in biased estimates of the effect of the slave trades on economic development. So, Yeah, that's totally fair, the eyes of sin. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and sort of interleave between the two. Nathan Dunn's a very good writer. And again, if you guys want to do this, like scholar.harvard or scholar.harvard.edu/nunn/home, you can read all of his papers under the papers and publication. What I'm trying to do, though, is hopefully for the people who like the prose, we can map that onto the code. And for the people who just want the code, we're going to be able to motivate the use of that code to through the use of the paper. So this is another interesting thing. This is this is basically some fairly good evidence that Nathan Nunn has been thinking very seriously about this issue, right? The claim that he's making here basically is saying, okay, you're a poor country, you don't have a lot going for you. And then some Europeans come along with an offer you can't refuse, all right? Sell us some of your people into slavery and you'll be better off. And so the idea here is saying that there's something about these countries that caused them to be underdeveloped in the first place, that caused them to go into the slave trade, and things haven't really changed for this country, so they continue to be underdeveloped, right? So the relationship here isn't that these countries are underdeveloped because of slavery, but rather slavery happened in these countries because they were underdeveloped, right? Maybe you believe that, maybe you don't, but as far as Nathan Nunn is concerned, that is a potential explanation in that relationship that he's seen. Again, we were talking about correlations. This is sort of the counter argument. And it's in one sense, right, it seems a very reasonable one, right? You can say, well, there's nothing that we can really, we need some more evidence to suggest one way or the other. And that will come later in the paper. I pursue a number of strategies to better understand the reason behind the relationship between slave exports and current economic performance. So this is coming back to the original claim. First, I review the evidence from African historians on the nature of selection into the slave trades. I also use historic data on pre-slave trade population densities to examine whether it was the less developed parts of Africa that selected into the slave trades. Both sources of evidence show that it was actually the most developed parts of Africa that tended to select into the slave trades. I discuss the reason behind this seemingly paradoxical relationship in detail. Second, I use instruments, so this is an econometric term, we'll explain it when we get to it, to estimate the causal effect of the slave trades on subsequent economic development. The instruments are the sailing distances from each country to the nearest locations of demand for slave labor in each of the four slave trades. Like the OLS coefficients, the IV coefficients are negative and significant, suggesting that increased extraction during the slave trades caused worse subsequent economic performance. So I am not going to blame you if you're very confused by this statement. OLS is a method of inference that we're going to use. It's called ordinary least squares. I will explain it when we use it. IV, that's instrumental variables. This is another thing that's used to try and say there might be something that we haven't captured in our data, but we're going to get something that's sort of related to it and be able to identify this mystery thing that we can't see. And in this case, using both of these methods, he got the same result. And this is what we mean when we talk about robustness. So this I'm going to leave on the table until we get to it, because again, I can spend a lot of time explaining this and we won't get to any of the code. But what I think we'll do is before we put down code, we're going to make sure that we understand why we're doing a certain thing. I then explore the precise channel of causality underlying the relationship between slave exports and economic development. Using historical evidence as a guide, I examine whether the procurement of slaves through internal warfare, raiding, and kidnapping resulted in subsequent state collapse and ethnic fractionalization. I find that the data are consistent with these channels. So the idea here is that when you go to acquire slaves, you are sort of breaking at the fabric of the country, and it's leading to these things that we associate with lower economic performance. So in this case, he's specifically saying it's like, you can say, okay, so now I believe you about this relationship. Slave trade did cause lower economic performance. Why did it do that? And one of the potential explanations here is things like state collapse and just generally institutions which are not conducive to economic growth. These findings complement the research of Engerman and Sokolov, 1997-2002, which shows that slavery in the New World resulted in the evolution of institutions that were not conducive to economic growth. I promise you I didn't read that line, but I guess just I've been exposed to this type of language. But yeah, so I completely did not need to go on my tangent. I really should have read this ahead of time. My results show that not only was the use of slaves detrimental for a society, but the production of slaves, which occurred through domestic warfare, raiding, and kidnapping, also had negative impacts on subsequent development. The paper is structured as follows. In the following section, I provide a description of Africa's slave trades, providing a detailed historical overview of the manner in which slaves were procured and the resulting adverse effects. In section 3, I describe the construction of the slave export figures. So this is when we're going to start explaining some of these variables. Section 4 documents the correlations that exist in the data. So that's going to be quite a bit of programming that we do there. And section 5 turns to the issue of causality. So that's when we're going to start using the instruments. In section 6, guided by the historical evidence, I examine the potential channels of causality. Section 7 concludes. So the biggest takeaway from section 1 here is we're going to say that the slave trade causes modern economic performance to decrease. The relationship is causal, and the specific reason why that relationship is causal is that countries that had the slave trade spent a lot of time going to war and kidnapping and just generally sort of eroding the social fabric of that country. And as a result, the scars that are borne by that acquisition of slaves are sort of carried to this day, and that's why these countries have performed worse. So, historical background. Between 1400 and 1900, the African continent experienced 4 simultaneous slave trades. The largest and most well-known is the Transatlantic slave trade, where, beginning in the 15th century, slaves were shipped from West Africa, West Central Africa, and Eastern Africa to the European colonies in the New World. The 3 other slave trades, the Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean slave trades, were much older and predated the Transatlantic slave trade. During the Trans-Saharan slave trade, slaves were taken from the south of the Saharan desert to northern Africa. In the Red Sea slave trade, slaves were taken from inland of the Red Sea, from inland of the Red Sea and shipped to the Middle East and India. In the Indian Ocean slave trade, slaves were taken from eastern Africa and shipped either to the Middle East or India or to plantation islands in the Indian Ocean. A number of characteristics of Africa's slave trades make them distinct from previous slave trades. First, the total volume of slaves traded was unprecedented. During the transatlantic slave trade alone, approximately 12 million slaves were exported from Africa. Another 6 million were exported in the other 3 slave trades. These figures do not include those who were killed during the raids and those who died on their journeys to the coast. The total effect of the slave trades, according to the calculations by Patrick Manning, 1990, was that by 1850, Africa's population was only half of what it would have been had the slave trades not taken place. Africa's slave trades were also unique because, unlike previous slave trades, individuals of the same or similar ethnicities enslaved one another. This had particularly detrimental consequences, including social and ethnic fragmentation, political instability, and a weakening of states, and the corruption of judicial institutions. So again, you can see some of these themes that we talked about at the beginning coming back in terms of the background. The most common manner in which slaves were taken was through villages or states raiding one another. Northrop, 1978, Lovejoy, 1994. And so if you guys are not familiar with academic papers, each time that there's a parenthetical remark with a name and a year, this is referring to a specific paper. So if you go to the back here, if we want to see like Northrop, for instance, any piece of scholarship is always going to build on work that's come before. So, there's a famous line by Isaac Newton, if I've seen farther, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. These are the giants. This is the shoulders on which all of this stands. So the paper that's being referred to here, David Northrop, Trade Without Rulers, Pre-Colonial Economic Development in Southeastern Nigeria. This seems to be a book published in 1978, Oxford Clarendon Press. So again, any claim that's made here should basically either there's data to back it up, this is Nunn's original work, or it's based on some work that people have done before. So that really famous one that I talked about, Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson, Colonial Origins of Comparative Development and Empirical Investigation. This is the 2001 paper. This is a huge one. And Acemoglu and Robinson went on to write a book called Why Nations Fail, which is a really good one. But that's what those things mean, if that wasn't clear. And again, I apologize for those of you who already know this stuff, but I'm trying to make this as sort of self-contained as I can. I'm maybe not going to give you like a full econometrics lesson, but we'll at least explain why we're doing certain things. So Northrop and Lovejoy are the ones who did this work. Where groups of villages had previously developed into larger-scale village federations, relations between the villages tended to turn hostile, e.g. Azevedo, 1982, Inikori, 2000, Hubble, 2001. As a result, ties between villages were weakened, which in turn impeded the formation of larger communities and broader ethnic identities. Kusimba, 2004, writes that insecurity confined people within ethnic boundaries, constructing spheres of interaction. Because of this process, the slave trades may be an important factor explaining Africa's high level of ethnic fractionalization today. This is significant for economic development, given that the established relationship between ethnic fractionalization and long-term economic growth. Easterly and Levine, 1997. Because Bill Easterly, incidentally, is on Twitter, so you can follow him if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Nathan Dunn is as well, but he seems to just do a lot of liking and retweeting. He doesn't really write a lot himself. Because of the environment of uncertainty and insecurity at the time, individuals required weapons, such as iron knives, spears, swords, or firearms to defend themselves. These weapons could be obtained from Europeans in exchange for slaves, who were often obtained through local kidnappings. This further perpetuated the slave trade and the insecurity that it caused, which in turn further increased the need to enslave others to protect oneself. Mahdi, 1992, Hawthorne, 1999. Historians have named this vicious cycle the gun slave cycle, e.g. Lovejoy 2000, or the iron slave cycle, e.g. Hawthorne 2003. The result of this vicious cycle was not only that the communities raided other communities for slaves, but also that members of a community raided and kidnapped others within the community. Well-documented examples come from the Balana of modern-day Guinea-Bissau and the Minyanka, sorry, I'm not very good with African names, of modern-day Mali, Klein 2001, and the Makua, Chikunda, and the Yao of East Central Africa, Alpers 1969 and Isaacman 1989. Generally, the consequence of internal conflict was increased political instability, and in many cases, the collapse of pre-existing forms of government, Lovejoy 2000. In the 16th century, northern Senegambia, the Portuguese slave trade was a key factor leading to the eventual disintegration of the Yolof Confederation, which was replaced by the much smaller kingdoms of Walu, Kajur, Bal, Sin, and Saloum. Further south, in southern Senegambia, the same pattern is observed. Prior to the slave trades, complex state systems were in the process of evolving. However, this evolution stagnated soon after the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century, Berry 1998. Similar patterns of instability have also been documented in Eastern Africa, e.g. Isaacman 1989 and Majibwe 2000. In the late 19th century, the slave trades resulted in the disintegration of the Shamba Kingdom, the Gweno Kingdom, and the Peri States in East Africa's Pangani Valley, Kimambo 1989, Majibwe 2000. So we're just going to pause here for a second just to make sure everybody's caught up. So again, think about it this way. You could live in Canada, the States, the UK. A lot of us live in democracies. We have property rights. We have certain rights for individuals. If you want to go out and you want to build a business, you do not need to think that much. I mean, obviously, there's definitely crime that happens. But the idea here is that in the countries that we live in, the expectation, if not the reality, is that our property will be protected, that if somebody does come after our property, that we can call the police, and when the police come, we are not going to need to slip them a bribe to make sure that they actually prosecute the offender. Basically, the idea here is that we have, and we choose our government. If we don't like what the government does, every 4 or 5 years, we can kick them out. There's a certain social structure. And when when I want to go and found a business, I do not need to consider, well, how many mercenaries do I need to hire to make sure that my store doesn't get mobbed and people just take everything inside of that store? And what this is talking about is the idea that, let's say you were a community that said, I don't want to take slaves. I think slavery is wrong. Well, if your neighbors want to participate in the slave trade, if they want to enrich themselves, then they're probably not going to choose within their community. They're probably going to go, and they're probably going to go and raid another village, and they're probably going to, enslave the other people, right? It's always better when somebody else gets enslaved and not you. So it's like, okay, well, now we need to defend ourselves. Well, what's the best thing to defend yourself with? A gun, and the Europeans have guns. Okay, well, what do we have that the Europeans want? Oh. So the idea here is, even if you were originally not predisposed towards slavery, the necessity of your circumstance might actually lead you to be somebody who winds up taking slaves, either through conquest or through kidnapping people inside of your own community. Now imagine trying to prosper in an environment like that. If you're spending so much time focusing on defending yourself and making sure that the people next door, let alone the people in the next village, aren't trying to take you away, makes a pretty reasonable case to say that you're probably not going to be focusing on making the village prosper. And the consequences of that, this is a nice elaboration in terms of all of the effects that this had over that 500-year period. The most dramatic example may be in the Congo Kingdom of the West Central Africa. As early as 1514, the kidnapping of local Congo citizens for sale to the Portuguese had become rampant, threatening the social order and the king's authority. In 1526, Afonso, king of Congo, wrote to Portugal complaining that, quote, there are many traders in all corners of the country. They bring ruin to the country. Every day people are enslaved and kidnapped, even nobles, even members of the king's own family. Visinia, 1966. This breakdown of law and order was partly responsible for the weakening and the eventual fall of the once powerful state, in Ikori, 2003. For many of the other Bantu-speaking ethnicities, stable states also existed in earlier periods, but by the time the slave trades were brought to an end, few ancient states remained. Colson, 1969. Pre-existing government structures were generally replaced by small bands of slave raiders, controlled by an established ruler or warlord. However, these bands were generally unable to develop into large, stable states. Colson, 1969, writes that, quote, both of the bands and the new states they created retained an air of improvisation. Few band leaders were ever able to hand power to a legitimate successor. Even where a band leader had become the ruler of a state, succession remained a problem. Leadership was a personal role rather than an established office. Isaacson says, so the slave trade had the potential result of neighbor turning against neighbor, as each group might have the desire to attack or enslave other groups in order to protect and keep safe their own. That's exactly what that's saying, Isaacson. Yes. The slave traders who also contributed to political instability by causing the corruption of previously established legal structures. In many cases, it became common to obtain slaves by falsely accusing others of witchcraft or other crimes. Quell, 1854, Northrop, 78, Lovejoy, 2000. So in this case, these are 3 different citations to establish this fact. Klein, 2001, writes that, quote, communities began enslaving their own. Judicial penalties that formerly had taken the form of beatings, payment of compensation, or exile, for example, were now converted to enslavement. Often, leaders themselves supported or even instigated the abuse of the judicial system. Mahdi, 1992, Hawthorne, 1999, 2003, Klein, 2001. To protect themselves and their communities from being raided, leaders often chose to pay slaves as tribute, which were often obtained through the judicial system. Hawthorne, 1999-2003, provides detailed studies of this process among the Kasanga of modern-day Guinea-Bissau. The chief of Kasanga used the, quote, red water ordeal to procure slaves and their possessions. Those accused of a crime were forced to drink a poisonous red liquid. If they vomited, then they were judged to be guilty. If they did not vomit, they were deemed not guilty. However, for those that did not vomit, this usually brought death by poisoning. Their possessions were then seized by their family and their family members were sold into slavery. Yes. Evidence from research showing a relation. This is another thing too, right? So one of the things we're talking about are a few different vectors through which political instability can be introduced. So even if we ignore the neighbor against neighbor story, the fact is, if you thought, so like let's take this to its most extreme case, right? So you find somebody who's stealing something of yours, and if you think that, so let's say the penalty for bringing a false charge is slavery. Are you going to think twice before you bring up that case against somebody who just robbed you? Absolutely you are. So that's another example through which societies were sort of eroded due to the slave trade. Evidence from research showing a relationship between a country's history of state development and subsequent economic performance suggests that these effects of the slave trades may be important for current economic development. Broxett, Chanda, and Putterman 2002, Chanda and Putterman 2005. Others have argued that Africa's underdevelopment is a direct result of state failure, which stems from Africa's weak and unstable pre-colonial political structures, Herbst 1997 and 2000. Because Africa's slave trades were an important factor affecting political underdevelopment, they may be a central reason behind Africa's weak states today. So that's the end of section 2. So that's given us some motivation, and section 1 gave us some motivation. Section 2 gave us some background, and you can see that we've got a very clear political story that we're going to tell in terms of the effect that slavery has. Now we're going to turn to the data. We're going to say, what do we have that will allow us to ask this question? How can we come up with a systematic way where we have some rules that we agree on what's going to be true and what isn't? And this is when we're going to start, again, we're going to start working on the program a little bit. We've already brought the program in. If you missed it, you do need to do install package Haven before you write this. But we saw, if you can go to a little bit earlier in the video, it'll show you how RStudio does all this. So now we're going to talk about the data that we're going to use to ask this question. And then in the next section, we're actually going to start asking the question. This is going to be a little more programming intensive and a little bit less reading. So, section 3, slave export data. Because I am interested in examining the effects of the slave trades that resulted because of the procurement of slaves, my measure of interest is the total number of slaves taken from each country during the 4 slave trades between 1400 and 1900. There's a footnote here, so we'll read that. Ideally, I would also like to include people that entered into local domestic slavery. However, the necessary data to construct these estimates do not exist. I use 2 types of data to construct the slave export estimates. The first are data that report the total number of slaves exported from each port or region in Africa. I refer to these as shipping data. For the Transatlantic slave trade, the data are from the updated version of the Transatlantic slave trade database constructed by Eltis et al., and this is in 1999. So in principle, you could probably access this yourself. The database records information for 34,584 voyages from 1514 to 1866. The shipping data are originally from various documents and records located around the world. Because in most European ports, merchants were required to register their ships and declare the volume and value of the goods transported for each ship and voyage, typically there exists a number of different registers and documents. In the database, 77% of the transatlantic slave voyages after 1700 have shipping information from more than one source. The average number of sources for each voyage is 6. It is estimated that the database contains 82% of all transatlantic slaving voyages ever attempted. Eltis and Richardson, 2006. So pretty high quality data for something so old. Data for the early period of the Atlantic slave trade is not covered by the Transatlantic slave trade database. Not covered by the Transatlantic slave trade database are from Ebel, 1997. For the Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Trans-Saharan slave trades, data are from Austin, 1979, 1988, 1992. The data are based on estimates from all available documents, records, and accounts by observers and government officials on the location and volume of the slave exports. With the shipping data, one can calculate the number of slaves that were shipped from each coastal country. However, this does not give an accurate indication of where slaves were originally captured. Slaves shipped from the ports of a coastal country may have come from a country located further inland. To estimate the number of slaves shipped from the coast that came from inland countries, I also use a second source of data that reports the ethnic identity of slaves shipped from Africa. This information comes from a variety of sources, such as records of sale, slave registers, slave runaway notices, court records, church records, and notarial documents. There are a number of ways of identifying the ethnicity or nation of a slave. I'll maybe just stop for a second here before I go into this. So if it's not clear what he's dealing with, right, is that it's so this is a cool idea, right? That the European slave trade was very well organized in terms of what what was measured. Obviously, if you're trading goods, you'll probably want to tax them, so you want to keep good records to make sure that you're collecting enough money. And of course, there's multiple ports. There's different places where these ships are going to go. And so if there's records, in this case, they can say, well, there's about an average of 6 records per ship. So that's a fairly good account. There's one problem with ships. They don't go on land. So what happens if you're a landlocked country? You might be the central hub of the slave trade. But if you're landlocked, you're not going to get the slaves from, you're not going to put a ship into a port that doesn't exist. You're going to take them to the closest port, and then you're going to put them on a ship. And so what Nunn does here is he's using data on the ethnicity of a slave to determine where they came from. There are a number of ways of identifying the ethnicity or, quote, nation of a slave. The easiest was often by a slave's name. Slaves were often given a Christian name and a surname that identified their ethnicity, e.g. Tardieu 2001. As well as slaves' ethnicity could be determined from ethnic markings, such as cuts, scars, hairstyles, or the filling of teeth. Carrack, 1987. Oldendorp, 1777, writes that, quote, "The people of all Negro nations are marked with certain cuts on the skin. As far as I have been able to learn from the Negroes themselves, these serve to distinguish one nation from another." End quote. Because slaves were legally defined as property, those engaged in the buying and selling of slaves had a strong incentive to correctly identify the birthplace or, quote, nation of slaves. Wax, 1973, and Moreno Fraginals, 1977, writes that, quote, "The slave trade was the business that involved the greatest amount of capital investment in the world during the 18th and 19th centuries. And a business of this size would never have kept up a classificatory scheme if it had not been meaningful in overall general terms in keeping with reality and designating in a very precise way the merchandise that was being traded." So again, what this is establishing here is the reliability of the data. Information on the ethnicities of slaves shipped during the transatlantic slave trade come from 54 different samples, totaling 80,656 slaves, with 229 distinct ethnic designations reported. Table 1 summarizes information about the samples used in the transatlantic slave trade. The table reports the location, the years covered, the number of slaves, and the number of ethnicities that could be identified for each sample. Similar tables for the other three slave trades are reported in Nunn 2007. So this is an earlier paper that he wrote. This is not something we're going to be able to do for ourselves, by the way. This is him reporting the documentation. So the ethnicity data for the Indian Ocean slave trade comes from 6 samples, with a total of 21,048 slaves and 80 different ethnicities reported. The data for the Red Sea slave trade are from 2 samples, one from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and the other from Bombay, India. The samples provide information for 67 slaves, with 32 different reported ethnicities. For the trans-Saharan slave trade, 2 samples are available, one from Central Sudan and the other from Western Sudan. The samples provide information on the origins of 5,385 slaves, with 23 different ethnicities recorded. The shipping data from Austin, 1992, also provide additional information on which caravan slaves were shipped on, the city or town that the caravan originated in, the destination caravan, and in some cases the ethnic identity of slaves being shipped. So I'll take a quick look here at Table 1. There's not a lot that I can do with it. Again, just a reminder, you can go to Nathan Nunn's website, scholar.harvard.edu/nunn/home, if you'd like to see this table yourself. But this is basically a report of locations, number of observations. This is where all of the data is coming from, right? So in this case, you have an example here. So Crown Records versus, where was it? There was Parish Records here. Sales Records were another. So this is basically saying, you know, you've got the location, you've got the years that it covers, the number of ethnicities that are in the records, the number of observations, so the number of slaves. Largest one would be Trinidad, it looks like, 12,460 in the slave registers. Followed also by Sierra Leone. And then finally the record type. So records of sales, plantation accounts, newspaper reports, examples like that. To illustrate how I combine the ethnicity data with the shipping data to construct my estimates, I use an example which is shown in Figure 1. The figure is a hypothetical map of the western coast of Africa, with each square representing a country. From the shipping data, I calculate the number of slaves shipped from each coastal country in Africa. In this example, 10,000 slaves were shipped from country A, and 25,000 were shipped from country C. Okay, so here's country A, here's country C. This is people getting on a boat. The problem with relying on the shipping data alone is that many of slaves shipped from country A may have come from country B, which lies landlocked behind country A. Then, using the ethnicity data, I calculate the ratio of slaves from each coastal country relative to any landlocked countries located inland of the coastal country. This requires that I map ethnicities to countries and aggregate up to the country level. In practice, this step relied on a great amount of past research. Hello, Elkanu. How are you doing? I think I need to do my shout-outs in a second here, but let me just finish this this thought, and then we'll go through. Thank you very much for that host, Elkanu. Great amount of past research by African historians, linguists, and ethnographers. The sources most heavily used are Kell, 1854, Murdoch, 1959, Curtin, 1969, Higman, 1984, and Hall, 2005. So again, we've got country B feeding country A, we've got country D and E kind of feeding country C. But we'll see the example here in a second. Actually, before I go to the next paragraph, I'll do in the order that they did the hosts, so and presents. So we've got Kite 260 in here. Kite's a wonderful caster who I don't get a chance to see as often as I would like, although I'm saying this about a lot of people recently. But he's one of the best co-op casters that I know. He's got a very friendly community. He's a really friendly guy. And I'm always really happy whenever he's stopping by and watching the cast. So if you guys especially if you guys like co-op cast, if you want to see a guy who's really mastered that type of broadcast, I'd strongly recommend Kite. He's actually somebody who will make even starting casters seem a lot more experienced based on sort of his ability to do these interactive casts. Eyes of Sin is a recent addition to the I was going to say audience, followers. I can't remember. Here we go. Gonna say audience. Eyes of Sin on Twitch. I don't know what you were streaming, but it says right here, or it used to. Let's peek. Hey, so Eyes of Sin draws things too. I haven't played How to Fool Boyfriend yet, and got Legend of Zelda, which I haven't played yet as well. So I didn't know you streamed Eyes of Sin, so there you go. Sorry for missing that. So Eyes of Sin is a new addition to the cast in terms of people who watch. And I don't know if I can... I was going to say, I will have to leave her sales to... her salesmanship to herself. But I can definitely say that Eyes of Sin has been absolutely wonderful to have inside of the casts so far. I want to check things out just because she's been a pleasure to have inside. We've got Jessie Quill, who has been streaming quite a bit more recently. She's been doing the Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker. I really like it when she does story-based games because she's got a background in psychology, and that particular game, of course, has a very heavy psychological element. So it's a perfect time to be watching her. In fact, I kind of wanted to do The Walking Dead tonight, but I knew she wouldn't be able to watch it, and I wasn't feeling 100%. So I thought I would do this creative stream instead. But Jessie Quill is one of my dearest friends. She's a mod as well. So I definitely encourage you to check her out. And finally, we've got Elkanou, who I'm happy to see here because the French colonialism will be coming up in a minute. But Elkanou is a great French caster. He is somebody who I think anybody in any language can really appreciate because of his physicality, his sense of humor. He's got a great taste in games. He's a lot of fun to watch. And again, he streams just about everything. But he's outdone English casters for me on certain games. And I've definitely wound up buying some games that he's brought to my attention. So all of these are wonderful casters who I strongly recommend that you check out. Anyways, sorry, back to the paper. But I wanted to, I had a few shout outs that I was behind on. So, right. Assume that the ratio of slaves in country A relative to country B is 4:1. This ratio suggests that 20% of the slaves shipped from country A were actually from country B. Therefore, the estimated number of slaves from country B is 20,000 and from country A is 80,000. Assume that the ratio of slaves from country C to D to E is 3:1 to 1:1. The same procedure yields an estimate of 150,000 slaves from country C and 50,000 each from countries D and E. So 1:1 ratio between D and E and 3:1 between country C. That's what that leads to. It's a little hard to verbally say this. It's a little easier when you have things like on pages to compare. So in practice, these calculations are all performed separately for each slave trade. As well, because slaves were increasingly taken from further inland as each slave trade progressed, the calculations are also performed separately for each of the following time periods: 1400 to 1599, 1600 to 1699, 1700 to 1799, and 1800 to 1900. Oh, that's really funny, Eyes of Sin. Because ethnicities tended to be much smaller than countries, the mapping of ethnicities into countries is generally not problematic. This is illustrated in Figure 2, which shows African ethnicities based on Murdoch's 1959 classification, as well as modern political boundaries. So the political boundaries are the dark ones, and the little, sort of the light gray ones are the ethnicities. So you'll notice that a lot of these are sort of contained within the country itself. So the source of angst on this one is not being able to map an ethnicity to a country. By the way, I really wish I could make maps like this. From the figure, it is apparent that ethnicities are much smaller than modern boundaries, and therefore ethnicities generally map cleanly into one country. There's a footnote here. In instances where ethnicity is located in more than one country, I map the ethnicity into the multiple countries using land areas as weights. This is explained in detail in Nunn 2007. So if you really want to know about this procedure, you can obviously refer to his other paper, but this is describing the data as we're about to get it. Then when we get the data, we need to do our own manipulations on it. An important assumption in this procedure is that slaves shipped from a port within a country are either from that country or from countries directly to the interior. However, in reality, some slaves shipped from a country's coast may not have originated from the neighboring coastal country. In Nunn 2007, using 3 samples of slaves for which we know both the ethnicity of the slaves and the port that they were shipped from, I test the validity of this assumption and the overall accuracy of the estimation procedure. I find that for each of the 3 samples, my procedure correctly identifies the origins of between 83 to 98% of the slaves in the samples. A second source of measurement error arrives because slaves from the interior will tend to be underrepresented in the ethnicity samples. This is because only slaves who survive the voyage outside of Africa are in the ethnicity samples. All else equals, the further inland a slave originated, the longer the journey was, and the more likely it was that he or she died along the way. Because the rates of mortality during the slave trades were extremely high, this form of measurement error may be significant. With a corresponding footnote, estimates of cross-Atlantic mortality rates range from 7 to 20% depending on the time period and the length of the voyage, occurred in 1969 and Lovejoy 2000. Death rates during the trek to the coast are known with less certainty, but estimates range from 10 to 50%. So that's half the slaves that are being walked to the port potentially died. However, as I show formally in the appendix, the undersampling of slaves from the interior results in OLS estimates that are biased towards 0. As well, one can use instruments that are uncorrelated with the measurement error to derive consistent estimates. I do this in section 5b. So we won't do the appendix unless we finish everything else. But the one thing about the estimates that are biasing towards zero, the reason we don't worry too much about this potential measurement error is it's actually going to make the argument harder to make. So the idea here is that if there's going to be a bias from this undersampling, it's going to move the bias away from saying that the slave trade is responsible for lower modern economic performance. So if we find a result that says that the slave trade is responsible for low economic performance, and we say, well, your estimates are biased, they're biased towards not having an effect. It's like, oh, so you're saying that the effect could be larger. Maybe it is, but obviously the point is still made, right? So this is the important thing, is that it's not the end of the world if you identify potential sources of biases in your estimates, and that's why it's important to read the material and understand why we're asking a certain question. Because if, the world is imperfect and we live in a world that has slavery, so clearly it's imperfect. But of course, empirically, in terms of the work that we'll do, all of your data is not always going to be tidy like you find it in a textbook. So you need to think for a little bit, does this cause a problem for my argument? If it does, is there a way that I can get the same point made without this source of bias? So after the data have been constructed, I have estimates of the number of slaves shipped from each country in Africa during each of the four slave trades during 4 different time periods: 1400, 1599, 1600, 1699, 1700, 1799, 1800 to 1900. Table 2 reports the estimated total number of slaves exported from each country, as well as the total disaggregated by slave trade. Overall, the estimates are consistent with the general view among African historians of where the primary slaving areas were. This is a nice little bit of external validity. You've got a historian saying, hey, this country had a really big slave trade, and Nathan Nunn's results say, yep, there's a lot of slaves coming from this area here. If you got a number that was different from what historians say, then you need to wonder if all of this work that came ahead was appropriate. It really is Yorkshire bastard, but it's important to study. During the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were taken in the greatest numbers from the, quote, slave coast, Benin and Nigeria, West Central Africa, Zaire, Congo, and Angola, and the Gold Coast, Ghana. All of these countries appear among the top exporting countries on the list. Ethiopia and Sudan are also among the top exporting countries because they were the primary suppliers of slaves shipped during the Red Sea and Saharan slave trades. The low number of slave exports from South Africa and Namibia confirms the view of African historians that these areas exported virtually no slaves, Manning 1983. The relative magnitudes of exports from geographically close countries are also consistent with the qualitative evidence from African history literature. Manning 1983 writes that, quote, some adjoining regions were quite dissimilar. Togo exported few slaves and the Gold Coast many. Gabon exported few slaves and the Congo exported many, end quote. The estimates are consistent with Manning's observation. Exports from Togo are far less than from Ghana, and exports from Gabon are less than from the Republic of Congo. So just to, doesn't hurt to take a mental rest because we've had a lot of talk here. So what that passage just described. So we've got these log export normalized by area, and exports normalized by population, and we've got this over 52 different countries. So these numbers here are the result of all of that work that Nathan Nunn did in those previous paragraphs. There's obviously some other things that are measured here as well, but basically what that passage was talking about, these pretty important measures, export area, export population, that was describing where it came from. So that in principle, if you wanted, you could go and get those books and you could do a similar exercise to say, yep, he didn't make up the numbers. Of course, he is a Harvard professor and he's, he has a history of studying these questions. So he is fairly reliable on this. Just a quick word too. So clearly, when we look at this data set here, we don't have the individual slave trades, I don't think. We've got fractionalization, we've got the distances of the different slave trades, but I believe he has aggregated all the slave trades in and these here. So when we take a look at this table, this isn't something that we can replicate, but basically, from Angola, 3.6 million slaves through the transatlantic slave trade, nothing from the Indian Ocean, Trans-Saharan, or Red Sea. If you want an example of one that had multiple, slave trades operating through it, 823 slaves through the transatlantic slave trade, none through the Indian Ocean, but a little under 500,000 in the Trans-Saharan and 118,000 and the Red Sea, for a total of about 500,000 slaves. So again, this is a country by country breakdown. This isn't exactly the data that we're working with. This is a little more fine grained. Right. We're going to make a graph soon. So, okay. 4. Basic correlations, OLS estimates. I begin by estimating the relationship between past slave exports and current economic performance. I normalize the total number of slaves taken from each country by its size, measured by land area. Alternative measures of country size are also possible, as I show in Table A2 in the appendix. Using the average population of a country between 1400 and 1900 yields nearly identical results. Similarly, using arable land area rather than land area also yields essentially identical results. So for this study here, we're using one of those measures, which in this case, it's number of slaves divided by land area. But there were other measures that he used to make sure that that wasn't a specific one that he, quote, got lucky on. Figure 3 shows the relationship between the natural log of the number of slaves exported in all 4 slave trades between 1400 and 1900, normalized by land area, and the natural log of per capita GDP in 2000. 7. Because the natural log of 0 is undefined, I take the natural log of 0.1. As I show in the appendix, the results are also robust to the omission of these 0 export countries. So the natural log is a little difficult to explain if you haven't done this on your own, but the idea here is that the natural log has certain properties that make it desirable. One thing that it will do is it makes it easy to see rates of change. The other thing that matters when you're doing these kinds of studies, when we get to the regression, you need to have a linear form for your model. And one of the things that the natural log does is it makes it sort of easy to sort of split out some of these terms so that they're in a nice linear form. So it's especially when you're dealing with GDP, it's very common to deal with natural logs of things. I don't have a ready-made example of what happens when you do that, but what I will try and do, it's almost certain that I'm not going to be able to do this full paper. So what I might try instead is I'll see maybe between this. So if you guys are interested in seeing the rest of this, I'll definitely I'll definitely do more. And if we do that, I'll try and give you an example of what this natural log thing is. But basically, it's basically another adjustment that we do to make sure that we are, we're doing a sensible analysis. The same way that we want to say we don't care about the raw number of slaves, we care about the number of slaves normalized for something. We also take the natural log for not exactly the same reason, but another one which basically just says we are analyzing something very specific here. But it's a pretty standard transformation that you make, especially for GDP. And an important thing about the natural log is it doesn't change the order of things. So, and what we kind of care a little bit more is about the relationship rather than the specific value. So like saying 300 million or 100 million, for something, those are just numbers that I've said, and you know that one is bigger than the other. If I take the natural log, both of those numbers are going to be smaller, but all of a sudden it's not like the bigger one is not suddenly going to be ranked lower than the other one. It preserves the order of these things. I don't know if that made any sense, but anyways, what is important though is I'm not going to be able to exactly recreate this graph, but these are basically all of the countries. So you've got on the x-axis here, you've got the log of exports divided by the area. And on the y-axis here, you've got the log of real per capita GDP in the year 2000. So this is how much each individual person sort of produced. This isn't exactly what it is, but basically the amount of goods and services a country produced in 2000 divided by the number of people and is on this y-axis. And the number of slave exports per, I guess it's kilometer squared or something like that, is on the x-axis here. So notice here when you have a lower number of exports over the area, the GDP is higher. And when you have more exports, you have a lower GDP in 2000. Okay. Now, obviously, this is scattered all over the place. You can see, so, here's Egypt. Here's Namibia, Ghana. So the funny thing here, of course, is you've got, I don't know what Com is, Comoros. So Comoros is lower than Ghana, even though Ghana had some of the highest rates of slavery. So it's not a perfect relationship, but there's a line which we'll be able to draw. But basically, this is one of the first things you want to do when you have data. You can plot it on the screen, and you can see what that relationship is. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to open Ggplot 2. So library is the instruction to R to open up a particular package. Ggplot 2 is a package that lets me draw graphs. I'm just going to hit run here. If I wanted to, I could go into packages. Now this is one that you need to install, so if you don't have Ggplot 2, you can do install packages, or alternatively, if you're using RStudio, you can just click this convenient little install button. Now, I don't actually know that much about Ggplot 2, so let's just take a quick look here. Description, nope, it's the user guide. Nope. I know the name of the function that I want. It's like Ggplot. Okay, Ggplot is a shortcut designed to be familiar if you've used base plot. It's a convenient wrapper for creating a number of different types of plots using a consistent calling scheme. It's great for allowing you to produce plots quickly, but I highly recommend learning Ggplot as it makes it easier to create complex graphics. Well, I'm going to stick with Ggplot because it's easy. So what we're going to do here, we've got our x-axis, so Ggplot. Slave data. This is log export area, right? If you're ever confused about what piece of data you're using, you can always open it up here. Mr. Nunn was nice enough to give us a description of what this data is. So the log total slave exports normalized by the land area. Also, of course, because this is an IDE, it's automatically going to fill in the, I don't know, I like RStudio MC. See, graphs are really good though. Graphs help us see some relationships that we wouldn't otherwise. I might take a minute away from this paper and to explain why graphs are really important. So let me take a minute to do this. All right, so what was the convention? Then we've got Y. So that should be slave. I should probably explain what I'm doing here. So what this is doing, so Ggplot is the call to the function. Then we open the parentheses to give the arguments to the function. So this is what we're pouring into it. So Y is slave data. So that's our data set. Then the $sign is saying, is like, okay, so we're going to pick a variable inside here. We're going to take a column from that data. And in this case here, we wanted the GDP, or specifically the log of the per capita GDP in 2000, which is Ellen Madison PC GDP 2000. And I think I'll just give it, like a name and label the axes. So main character vector giving plot title. Yeah, okay. So main equals, I don't think I'm going to have enough space. Relationship between slave exports and GDP. Xlab equals log of exports for area. Ylab log of per capita GDP in 2000. Then we do another parentheses to close the function, or to close the call to the function. And if we run this, this should give us a graph. There we go. Okay, so it's a little hard to see because Nathan Nunn's graph gives the name of the countries, but you can sort of see so you see this sort of distribution at the line here. The scale's a little bit off, so this ends at 4.5. This probably ends more around 5, it looks like. It's log exports divided by area. So the linear relationships, I mean, I kind of see it here, but I would not blame somebody for maybe not seeing it. So one thing I want to learn is how to add a regression line. And I don't think it will say it in here. Incidentally, so it turns out one thing I could have done to make my life easier is I could have called data, slave data, and then I could have just called the variables. So I'll give you an example. So we should get the same result. There we go. Whenever you're doing, oh God, I can't remember I think it's numbers. Yeah, okay. Whenever you're writing code, it doesn't hurt to help people to let you know what you're doing. So load packages and import Nathan Nunn slave data. Plot relationship between GDP and slave exports. You don't actually need to close the. Okay. Just the thing about this is a nice thing to do. So somebody's still going to need to figure out how Ggplot works, but at the very least, this is just a nice little thing saying, here's why I did this. And this is the point. Especially if your code doesn't work as you were expecting, somebody who knows what you want to do can then say, oh yeah, what you wanted to do was insert XYZ or something like that. But anyways, I want to know how to do a regression line using Ggplot. So let's go to Google. I am definitely considering backseat gaming in this instance. This is a chance for me to learn. How do I plot a regression line using Ggplot? Oh, I have to do it on ggplot. I don't want to actually, ideally, if I can. Oh, you know what I can probably do? I bet. Oh, but this isn't using ggplot. Strat. I really wish there was an easy way to do this in Ggplot. See, one of the nice things is like there's a program that I use where basically I just do a regression. It just prints out a whole bunch of different plots for me, like especially like residuals and stuff like that. But I think I may be asking it to do too much. All right, well, we'll quickly reload. So what does Stack Overflow say? Trying to add a regression line on Ggplot. I tried with an ab line, but I didn't manage to make it work. Then I tried this, but it's not working either. In general, you need to provide your own formula, and you should use arguments x and y that correspond to the values in, I use SAS and Stata. SAS is the one that gives me a whole bunch of stuff just kind of out of the box. Will correspond to values you provided in Ggplot. In this case, x will be interpreted as x.plot and y will be interpreted as y.plot. More information about smoothing methods in the formula you can find in the help page of the function statsmooth, as it is default used by geom_smooth. Okay, so if you're using the same x and y values as you supplied the ggplot call and need to plot the linear regression line, you don't need to use the formula inside geom_smooth, just apply the method lm. Okay, let's see if I can just sort of copy this and work out roughly what I wanted them to do. So save data. I don't quite know how they make sense of this here. Okay, no, I get what they're doing. Okay, so I think this is what we need. I need to find out what stat summary is doing in there. So I have a feeling that it's going to complain when I say fun.data, but I'm going to run by it to test that hypothesis. And then the method lm. So I think this is going to throw an error, but let's see what happens. Invalid argument to unary operator. Okay, so let's see if replacing slave data does the trick. So we'll delete that empty graph. Ah! So I'm kind of curious what happens if I just straight up delete that. This doesn't result. I think what I might have to do is just, yeah. So I can't use any cheap can't use any cheap methods. We're just going to learn how to use ggplot. So ggplot data equals slave data. So you need to figure out what's going on in mapping. Default list of aesthetic mappings to use for the plot. If not specified, it must be supplied in each layer added to the plot. Okay, so generate some sample data, then compute the mean and standard deviation in each group. So, okay, it's created these. Summary data frame DS is used to plot larger red points on top of the raw data. Note that we don't need to supply the data or mapping in each layer because the defaults from Ggplot are used. So we've got Ggplot, so we've got... Oh, this is interesting. So the first argument is taken to be... Well, it shouldn't matter if I give a equals slave data. That I don't think that's a problem. So AES should be the X and Y's that I want. So then export area and LN Madison PC GDP 2000. Okay, so first thing I'm curious about, let's just see, one of the nice things about Ggplot, so the way I understand Ggplot is supposed to work is you should just be able to build up a graph sort of piece by piece. So let's see. Okay, so it didn't give us the dots. So we will go plus point. I don't know why it puts this empty one in, so let's just see what happens. Y equals export area. Wait. As you can see, I'm pretty much just guessing at this point, but that's fine because that's how you learn. And then I'm not going to add any of the variations in terms of like color and stuff like that, but okay, so I didn't like that. Okay, so it's used to construct the initial plot object and is almost always followed by a plus to add a component to the plot. There are 3 common ways to invoke Ggplot. The first method is recommended if all layers use the same data and the same set of aesthetics, although this method can be used to add a layer using data from another frame. Surely there is a... Let's go back to Google and ask a more general question. Because I remember I've used Ggplot2 once, and it... Okay, basic scatter plot. So the regression lines is exactly what I want. Okay, so I've got Ggplot data, x equals x variable, y equals y variable. So we'll change that. I'm just going to switch this off the screen for a second so I can write that out without covering it. So x y equals y. So geom point was right. In this case, so it's recommending I do shape equals 1. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to do a straight geom point. Still no dots. So I wonder if the data equals is causing the problem there. Well, let's do what the guide is saying, and then I can switch around. So shape equals 1. All right, so why doesn't it like this particular one? Okay, so the data is right. The x and the y variables should be what they are. I mean, the one thing I could try to be like really neurotic about it is I could go... But I still get the same error, so clearly that wasn't my problem. This all seems like rocket science magic from your perspective. Well, I mean, again, Isaacson, one of the things, so it's not necessarily the best for entertaining, right? Like, so this is clearly one of these points where I'm using a tool which I don't know perfectly. And as a result, I've sort of gotten myself worked into a little bit of a problem. So here are the things that I know. So we've got slave data. Okay, well, that's fine because we know that's the data we want to work with. Now, when I'm going to a guide, so like what we do is like the first thing we do is we read the manual, right? And we say, well, what are we trying to do? I'm taking some outside knowledge and I say, okay, well, we take Ggplot, which is a function. And the way that this works is sort of you build a foundation. And then what you do is you start adding data sort of on top. You add data on each layer. And so the idea is that you start with this canvas and then you add the dots, the geom point, and then you add the line. I mean, the whole reason we're doing this is I couldn't find an easy way to add the linear regression line on the plot. And I knew I was going to be using Ggplot2 anyway, so it seemed as good of a time as any to handle it. But yeah, as you can see, each of these examples here, they all start the same way. So you've got, okay, so we've made some data, which we've called DAT. So we don't call it DAT, we call it slave data, but that's not where the problem is. Next up, we want to do AES. Well, we've got that. And then we want to define our X variable and our Y variable. Well, that's still ln export area. You know, it worked last time. So if we're really paranoid about making typos, I mean, in this case, it sort of verifies it when you highlight it, right? So we've got Madison PC GDP 2000. We've got ln export area. So we're covered with that. And so, you know, again, once we've built this canvas, the next thing that we should be able to do is say, it's like, okay, first thing I want you to do, add some geometry. So geom point, and then I'll do shape equals 1 because that's what the tutorial recommends. But here we do run. Oh, and somehow mysteriously it works. So I will have to go back and double check. Maybe it was the fact that I did like an enter somewhere. Anyways, I think 3 is the solid circle, which I prefer a little bit more for this purpose. So nope, those are... I'm sure there's a manual somewhere which will tell me what the solid... Oh, for God's sake. What happens if I don't define a shape? There we go. There's my solid solid circles. Let's just clean out this. Okay. So the nice thing here is the next function that it uses. So here's how this is working. Okay. And I'm going to comment this out. So we are telling the program, here's what you want to work with. This is the data. Here are the specific things that I want you to work with. Here's your x-axis, here's your y-axis. We're going to do geom point. So that says put a whole bunch of little dots on the screen. And then geom smooth, which I only know of because of the tutorial here. This is something that I learned. And it says here, method lm. So this is actually going to draw something different from what I want. But you're going to see... Let's see what it looks like just because I'm a little curious myself. What it should do is it should also give us sort of like confidence. This little area here is sort of, it's like here's an area where we're fairly certain this is where it should lie. Like this is an estimate, and our estimate would sort of expect to be within these boundaries most of the time, is sort of the idea that's going on with this. But I don't want that, because that's not what Mr. Nunn's graph looks like. So we're going to say at C false. What that says is standard errors. I don't want those. So, and I'm pretty happy with that. I think that will take me through the rest of the example. So I'll close that out. We will clean this one more time. And again, it's possible there's an easier way for me to just take the Ggplot and add it, but I didn't know offhand. So we'll hit run. This is what we originally saw. Here is the Ggplot version. Now, obviously, I sort of messed up. I didn't give the titles for things, but that's fine. What were we comparing it to? We were comparing it to Nathan Nunn's original graph. He made his using Stata, but again, you can see the downward relationship. There's little dots that sort of correspond to, I'm covering up the axis, sorry. I don't know if I can get both. All right, there we go, just barely. You can see roughly these dots sort of correspond with each other. My aspect ratio is a little bit off between these things. But again, why did we do this? Why did we spend so much time on this? Well, because you need to look at the data. This is the worst mistake that I have for myself. And I'm actually going to look up an example to sort of show you the traps I can get myself into. I just need to remember... So where is this? Library data sets. Oh, cool. Okay, cool. So basically I'll do, I think I can just call... Yeah, I think mean x1. No. I wonder if I can do more than one. Nope. Okay. Okay, so this is the mean, this is the central tendency, also known as the average. So basically sum all of the things in this, well actually these are identical, so except for x4, so that's maybe not so interesting. But these all produce a mean of the same one. I could also do that for the y, so mean scum y1, mean and scum y2, mean y3. That one actually is a little closer than... I'm a little curious about that because they should all be the same. Okay, so we've got... If we take it to the first significance point, then it's the same. Basically, these have the same average. You can do this for a whole bunch of other things. You can do correlation, you can do variance. Numerically, these look very similar. But now we're going to do some Ggplots on these. So I think probably the easiest way for me to do this is just to rob my old Ggplot. I'm just going to get rid of all of this. Y1. So I'm just going to do this for each of these plots. So we've got 2, 3, 4, 4. Okay, so we're just going to go through each of these graphs. Oop. Okay. So didn't need this one. So this was plot number one, right? This looks a little bit like the sort of the reverse of the graph that we have. There's a clear linear relationship. This one has a bit of a curve. This one also has a linear relationship, except for one big outlier, right? So you notice that when you look at the slope, this one's a little bit steeper. This one's a little more shallow, but they produced basically the same. This one actually gave us the 7.5. So this one gave a slightly shallower one. I'm still not quite sure why, because these all should be the same. But as you can see, right, like the slopes between these two lines are not the same. And this one is a big stack of all the same value and then one huge outlier here. So the lesson on this one is basically that it's all well and good to just visually like look at the numbers on the page, and you can do a whole bunch of summary statistics. You can look at means, you can look at variance. These are all important things to look at, but nothing really matches plotting the data. You know, what is the relationship that you're interested in exploring? You know, and in this particular case, we said is like, okay, well, we want to see the relationship between slave exports and real GDP per capita. And as soon as we did that, you know, if we needed more convincing, we used the geom smooth to draw the regression line. But basically, we got all these little, we got this negative relationship, which of course none has already talked about. We're merely just replicating the results that he's done. But of course, this is also one of the reasons why these little experiments are exciting to do, right? I have now learned something about R that I didn't know before. And it wasn't just, I think there's something very important to learn sometimes in terms of working with a programming language of that. It's very easy. I mean, what we did in the first case, right, was to go and look at Stack Exchange, and then we looked at a tutorial or something like that. But there is definitely something about teaching yourself to go and say, I have a clearly defined problem. You know, I've been able to get little dots on a page, but I want to get little dots on a page and a line. And I want that line to have a specific relationship with those dots. And again, you can always ask a friend. You can always, I mean, at work, I can go to my coworkers and say, hey, how do I plot something in SAS or something like that? But there's definitely value in learning how to go and do some of this work on your own account. And in this particular case, this is a very important skill to have because, I mean, I've been there. I can remember times when I would print out reams of numbers and just look at them and think that I was doing work. And yet so much of this relationship gets communicated just simply by plotting the two things, right? What are the two things I'm interested? GDP is lower because there were more slaves from that area, right? That is communicated in this graph. And I'm not entirely sure that if I'd done a whole bunch of means or something like that, that would have been illustrated as clearly as if I had done that here. So again, sorry for doing a little noodling around. I mean, again, this is educational for me. And like I said, you can sit down and you can do a bunch of tutorials. Like I'm sure that book that I got that plot from has a lot of great little examples. But in this case, we get to follow along with a really interesting paper. So I hope you're all with me on saying that we have been able to sort of verify the contents of it. I mean, I again probably make things a little easier and like mess around with the dimensions. Yeah, I'll leave it for now. But yeah, if I made this square, it would probably look identical. But if anybody wants to challenge me on the traits of this thing, we'll deal with it then. Okay. So what have we learned? Well, one, we've learned how to plot things using Ggplot2. Number two, we have sort of established at least that first glance. We've established that correlation between the exports of slavery and a negative impact on GDP. As shown in the figure, a negative relationship between the income and slave exports is apparent in the raw data. I further examine this relationship by controlling for other country characteristics that are also potentially important for current income. My baseline estimating equation is log yi equals beta 0 plus beta 1 log exports I over area I plus C prime I delta plus X prime I gamma plus epsilon I. So I take it that none of you have any questions on that, and we will continue to read the paper. No. I am going to continue reading, but we're going to go back to this equation because you think you get it. Plotting it out gives you a better overall view of the data you're working with. Absolutely, Eyes of Sin. And Ggplot, I chose that particularly because it has a very specific way of thinking about it. So it says, hey, Ggplot, wake up. I've got something for you. Here's the data. Here's the two variables I'm interested in. I want you to give me a whole bunch of dots based on that data. And it says, okay, well, X was here, Y was here for this observation. So one goes here, one goes here, one goes here, one goes here, so on and so forth. And it says, in addition to that, I want you to put a line. Okay. I could add tons of other stuff on here if I wanted. But it's a really nice little way of saying, it's like, I'm going to build my graph point by point. I find that very attractive to work with. Although, as you can see, it was quite confusing for me to start off with, in terms of what I was working. Like, it took me a while to figure it out, right? So, anyways, baseline estimating equation. What does all this mean? Well, Nathan Nunn tells us. Okay, where log yi is the natural log of the real per capita GDP. So that's this thing here. And log exports I over area I, in country I in 2000. So the I is important here. This is a little index saying that this is the country we're concerned about, right? So Y in country I, exports in country I, area of country I, C of I, X of I, epsilon of I. Those are, I is the index. I tells us where we are. There's a difference between being in, Angola and Egypt. And the I, there will be 52 I's in the end because we have 52 different countries. So the idea of the math here is not to confuse people. It's to come up with a very concise and unambiguous way of saying what we're looking at. So this is the GDP for the country that you're looking at. Specifically, it's the GDP per capita, and we've taken the natural logarithm of it, keeping in mind that I'll probably have to explain why we take the natural logarithm on another stream. All right. Log exports I, area I. Again, we've already kind of covered that. The natural log of total number of slaves exported between 1400 and 1900, normalized by the land area. So number of people that were taken out of that specific country divided by the area of that country, take the natural log of it. Per capita GDP data are for the year 2000 and are from Madison 2003. So I'll explain the betas at the very end. How about? CI is a vector of dummy variables, also known as categorical or dichotomous variables, that indicate the origin of the colonizer prior to independence. So you will get a, this will probably make sense if I show you in the data. Remember these? So Britain, France, Portugal. You get a 1 if you were colonized by Britain in colony 1. You get a 1 if you've got if you were colonized by France. So for instance, I know in the third observation, Benin was colonized by France because it's got a 1 here, right? I know for the fifth observation, Botswana was colonized by the British. And the reason why it's noted like this is it's specifically dealing with, this is matrix notation. So this is basically, this is the collection of all those colonizer variables. These are included to control for other significant events in Africa's past colonial rule. So remember when we were talking about, remember when we were doing that history section and we talked about how the fact that colonization mattered quite a bit in terms of a country's economic performance? That's something that sort of motivated this paper. So we can't say this sort of thing was important and we're going to ignore it in our analysis. We have to include the effects of colonization. And not all colonizers are the same, so you have to include sort of an indicator for each one. Xi is a vector of control variables that are meant to capture differences in countries' geography and climate. So what we're going to be doing here is we're actually going to be assigning different things in this X. And we'll explain that shortly. But we didn't really explain what the betas and all that were. So some of you may not have really liked math, or maybe you liked math, but you found you didn't do very well in it. So sometimes this is where people get lost, or this is maybe where people get scared. So I want you to imagine a box or like a machine, okay? I'm going to put something in the machine and it's going to give me something out, okay? So let's say that this machine is times 2, okay? If I put the number 1 in the times 2 machine, it's going to pop out number 2, right? Because 1 times 2 is 2. If I put 2 in the times 2 machine, it's going to pop out 4, right? And if I put in 3, it's going to give me 6, 4, 8. You kind of know how this is going to work. Now think of that machine. We can also call that machine a function, okay? And what functions do, functions take inputs. This is a function too, by the way, Ggplot. Ggplot took the slave data and the 2 variables as arguments. We also added geom_smooth. Geom_smooth took 2 arguments. And that function gave us a graph. Graphs are a little hard to work with. So how about we limit this conversation to numbers? So what this function does, this gives me a number. So I give it some beta 0. I give it some beta 1. I give it some log exports area. I give it some C, some X, and some EI, and it's going to be able to tell me what the log GDP was. Now, notice that this is different for each country. The exports, the area, the CI, the XI, even the epsilon. Beta 0, beta 1, delta, and gamma are all, they don't have that I. So the idea is this. There's going to be some level of log GDP that gets produced. Okay, that's going to be like a base level. That's like, you know, if you're a country, you're going to produce this amount. Specifically, if you're a country in Africa, you're going to produce this amount. This number could be negative, by the way. This number could be 0. But there's some constant. Then, when we take the log of the exports over the area for a given country, we will multiply this number by some constant, which we're going to call beta 1, okay? And that is going to translate into economic output, okay? You can think of this as the effect that exports over area has on GDP. So let's pretend for a second that this number was 1, okay? Beta 1 was 1. If the log exports over area is 1 and everything else here was 0, then GDP is going to be 1. If log exports over area was 0.5, then the log GDP is going to be 0.5. Again, if all of these other things are 0. Now, what happens if beta 1 is 0? Well, if beta 1 is 0, then that means that exports over area doesn't have any effect. What happens if beta 1 is negative? Well, that would mean that the log of GDP goes down. So what this means, again, if you think about it, you can put any number in here, right? We know slavery in the area. We also happen to know what GDP was. But what we don't know is what the effect of slavery was. So one of the things that we do in statistics is we are trying to come up with estimates for what this beta 1 is. Okay? If beta 1 is really, really big and positive, then that means that your GDP goes up when you have more slaves, or when you export more slaves. If it's really big and negative, then that means that your economy is devastated when you have slave exports. And if this number is 0, then it means that it really doesn't have any effect. Okay? So if we just limited it to this is basically what we see. This is the relationship that we've plotted. The catch is that that's not the whole story. We were talking about some other things that can affect it. The colonial history, for instance. Okay, so we know who colonized these countries. we need to make sure that we estimate what the effect of colonization was. XI is, again, the controls. So remember, we were saying, well, what if it has like a lot of gold and oil, right? Won't their economy be better if they have that? Well, again, we want to account for that. We want to feed that data into the model. We want to put that back into our machine, our GDP machine. So we have this, we have this, we have this, we have this. We don't have this. I'm going to explain this in a little bit. But what we want to find is what beta 0, delta, gamma, and we especially want to know what beta 1 is. It's important to know what these are because we do need to know what the effect of the other things are. But if this is a negative number, then that means that slave exports have a negative impact on GDP. And that's after we account for colonizer effects, and that's after we account for our other controls. Now, this little epsilon I is a statistical idea. This is known as an error term. So basically, this sort of represents you can almost think of this as like a measure of our ignorance. And sort of the heart and soul of a lot of estimation is what you put on this. Not a problem, Elkanu. I might be finishing up in a little bit myself, but I do kind of at least want to get the regressions done, and then we'll find out if people have an interest in this carrying on, and then we'll take it from there. Friday I'll probably do Walking Dead though, but thanks a lot for stopping by, Elkanu. Okay, so we've got epsilon I. And basically, usually what we assume is that this is normally distributed. And so like some of you might remember this like bell-shaped curve. That's a normal distribution. The reason why we say it's centered around 0 is that we can easily make it centered around 0. We just change beta 0. And because we're estimating beta 0, whatever assumption we make about the mean here, we can just sort of give back to beta 0. So it's not that big of a deal to say that it's 0. There's also an assumption that we sometimes make for this one called homoscedasticity, and that says that the variance is going to be the same across all of the observations. That isn't always justified, but there's other ways of working out with that. So this might be a little hard to understand. So basically, here's another way of thinking about this. You say, if I want to know a country's GDP, or the log of its GDP per capita, then I'm going to estimate beta 0, the baseline amount. I'm going to estimate the effects of slavery and the log of how many slaves divided by the area of a given country. I'm going to find out who colonized it. I'm going to know what of these control characteristics, again, things like oil, diamonds, gold, latitude, longitude, all of these things. I'm going to know what those are. And then I'm going to put a certain restriction on everything that I could measure, all of the random elements. And I'm going to say that they're normally distributed with a mean 0 and sort of there's the same variance across all countries. And that's how I could sort of predict what the GDP is going to be. And with that particular assumption here, I can sort of solve all the equations and I can make estimates for what beta 0, beta 1, delta, and gamma were. And again, we're particularly interested in beta 1. Now, the method that we're going to use for this is called OLS, ordinary least squares. And one of the things that you do in that is basically you account for, again, all of these things, colonizer, the controls such as geography. And you basically try and come up with the line that kind of fits through that. This is easy to see because, like, again, you can sort of see that it goes through the middle of all the observations. But what this is doing is it's throwing in some other variables. So this would be like an 8-dimensional graph or something like that, which we clearly couldn't see. But basically, we're just going to try and fit this line again once we feed it some more information. And we're going to see once we give it some more information that might be related to GDP, do we still have the effect of slavery? One of the important things about this error term is that it can't be somehow related. We can't sort of be smuggling in some secret unobserved term that's sort of related to GDP. Otherwise, we potentially bias our estimates. And Nathan Nunn will deal with this a little bit later in the paper. I may not be able to do it myself, because section 5 is coming up and I do kind of need to get to bed. But how about we do the OLS? And then if you guys are interested, we can continue with the causal argument for the second part. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about how we can believe this formula. But for now, I'm going to fit one of these models on the computer, and then we're going to go back and talk about sort of how you relate between these two things. So if you're confused by this, don't worry too much. We'll come back to it and we'll see if we can maybe remove some of that confusion. OLS estimates of 1 are reported on table 3. The first column reports estimates of 1 with colonizer fixed effects only. So that's basically this graph right here. Oh, sorry, that's not this graph here. That's this graph with colonizer fixed effects. So we say who had the colony. In the second column, I also include controls that capture the potential importance of geography for long-term economic development: distance from the equator, longitude, minimum monthly rainfall, average maximum humidity, average minimum temperature, and proximity to the ocean measured by the natural log of coastline divided by land area. All factors except longitude influence whether a country has a tropical climate, which affects the prevalence of infectious disease and agricultural productivity. Karamak, 1976, Sachs et al., 2001. Longitude is also included to capture differences between the eastern and western parts of the African continent. A related concern is that the slave exports variable may simply capture a West African fixed effect. I show in the appendix that the results are robust to also controlling for region fixed effects. In both specifications, the estimated relationship between slave exports and per capita income are negative and statistically significant. So how about we do these two first and then we move on to his concerns. So I'm going to move this aside for a little bit just so I can easily see what variables he used. So we're going to use a function in R. So for OLS. Okay, just a quick description. Again, it's always good to comment your code so people can come back and see kind of what's going on. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do LM, which stands for linear model. And I don't remember how this function works properly, so we're going to quickly go to help just so I can see. Actually, you know what? Help LM. All right. Wants to know the formula, data, subset weights. I'm pretty sure I can work with all of this. Okay. So formula is going to be ln medicine PC GDP 2000. I screwed up. Let's actually start. I'm going to do comma data equals slave data. I wonder if RStudio is smart enough for me to know. It does not. Okay. Sun PC GDP 2000. Okay. So remember, what we're doing here, we're basically fitting this equation. So there's our Y. I believe you need to use the tilde. There should be an example. Yep. They put a space in between them for some reason. Okay. So the first one was just the exports over area and then the colonizer fixed effects. The colonizer fixed effects are going to be a little tricky. I know there's a way to group the data. I don't remember offhand how to do it. Well, should be able to find that actually. How do I group variables for a model? That article doesn't help. Yeah, you know what? That's going to take two. I'm just going to, you know, it probably won't hurt to make this explicit anyway. So we're going to start with the one we're most interested in, which is the log of the exports over area. Then we put a plus sign because, of course, that's what we had inside of our model. And we said that for our first specification, we were just going to worry about the colonizer effects. So it's colony 0 through 7. I just want to double check. Oop. I hope I do this right. So colony 1, 0. It was, okay. Now, you know what? Let's not worry about being tidy. Colony 1. Mm. 2, 3, 4. You know what? This is going to be a mess in a little while, so I don't know a tidy way to do that. I mean, there is a way to group these all together, and I've done it before. I just, again, I don't use R that much, so that's kind of why I wanted to do this. Colony 6. The sharp-eyed amongst you will notice I'm making a mistake here. 7. What I don't know, though, is whether or not R yells at me for making this mistake. So let's check it out. Okay, so it just drops it. So why is there an NA here? There's a thing known as the dummy variable trap. And what you want to do, you are trying to avoid what's known as sort of perfect collinearity. You don't want to have your variables be a sort of a linear transformation of all the other ones, because that makes your model impossible to identify. So when you have dummy variables, what you want to do is you want to drop at least one. And that's going to be, so like one way you can sort of think about this, it's not maybe, I don't know if it's the most rigorous way of thinking about it, but what you can say here is that you've got some baseline level, right? That's what that beta 0 is, or, you know, or just say in general, you know, you've got the world as it is, and you're making a comparison against things, okay? So you've said, here are all the possible states of colonization for a country, including uncolonized. So if we include all possible states, what's our baseline? What's our point of comparison, right? I've said, you know, I've already said that you're in colony 0 if you aren't colonized by anybody. So we haven't allowed for some baseline case, right? And you need to do that in the case of dummy variables. So if you know stats, I think you're probably just screaming at your monitor right now. I apologize. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drop the variable that says you haven't been colonized. And that's going to be sort of what our base case is. We're going to say it's like, okay, well, you didn't get colonized. And so all of these other ones are just going to be tracking the effect of all these various colonization. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to store this in an object. I'm going to call it spec1, or no, I'm going to call it OLS1. Excuse me. The reason I'm saving this in an object, so I've got this. One of the things that R does, there's a lot of information that's packed inside here, right? This has solved that model for me. Maybe I don't want to see the results right away. I mean, I already do see them here, but I might want to save them and call them up for later. And I did say that we were going to do, we were going to do some other ones. So I'll just make a quick note. Only colonizer effects. The next one, what was that? Colonizer and geographic effects. So I'm going to bring up my list of variables again. I'm going to steal the data here. So we're going to call this one OLS2 because this is the second specification. I'm going to keep all the colony dummies. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to add the distance from the equator. So he said he added the distance from the equator, the rainfall, humidity, temperature, and the log coastline. All right. So abs latitude. That's going to be our distance from the equator. If you're having trouble with that, just consider the absolute value. So that would be, you can have a negative or a positive value. All that it's really worried about is how far away from zero it is. If zero is the equator, you know that this is distance from the equator because it's taking an absolute. The other one is just longitude on its own. So if you're like, oh God, I didn't know I needed to know geography as well, you can rely on your math and just say the absolute value is going to be what gives you distance from the equator, whereas longitude, it's not going to, even if you didn't know what that was specifically measuring, you could just take the fact that, well, it's not measuring a magnitude away from something, it's just measuring its position. So that's kind of how I do things when I get stuck, is I try and think, well, what information do I know and how can I make that square with the other things? So we said distance from the equator, longitude, lowest monthly rainfall, that would be rain min. Incidentally, if you're not using RStudio for some reason, one way that you can get some really quick information about your data is str, and then you just put in your data set, so slave data. Basically, you get the information that's here. Obviously, I like using an IDE like RStudio because it allows me to sort of click and have these things available in different windows. But if you're one of these old school types who likes using a terminal, str will do that. Of course, if you're one of those hardcore types that likes using a terminal, you probably don't need me to tell you what these commands are. So I realize this may not be too exciting for everybody because I am just plugging away on some code, but I will, again, I will reiterate what we're doing with each of these things before we go into interpreting the results. And then we'll probably call it a night once we get these. So next up was humidity. So I think these are in, max humidity. Oops, wrong window. Okay, so humid max. We wanted average minimum temperature. I think that's low temp. Yeah, minimum average, that's the label here. So again, it looks tidier if you double click on it and look at it in the data window, but then I'd have to move my script out of the way. Okay, so we've got our low temp. What was next? The log of the coastline. Yep. And coastline area. Okay. And then we have to add at least one more plus. Let's see how many I can fit. Okay, I can get at least one colony in there, and we'll get the rest. And I guess data, you have to sit on your own. Okay. So, got our two specifications. Let's just run that. Let's stop, think about what we've done, and then we will look at the numbers. Remembering, of course, too, we're trying to replicate this paper, so we're trying to see if we can get the same results using Nathan Nunn's data that he did. So, log of GDP per capita for a given country. So we've said use the slave data. So LM, we're fitting a linear model. If you were to graph this, this would show up as a line because it's all just pluses with coefficients. There's no squares or anything like that there. It's one of the reasons why we use the natural log. We don't have anything that we're multiplying this this beta with. There's no data that's going beside this. It's just standing on its own, so we don't need to give a value there. But here we've got GDP per capita. We've got the log of exports over area for a given country. Our colonizer fixed effect, so that's colony 1 through 7, remembering that if we include colony 0, we fall into the dummy variable trap and we don't allow for comparison against anything. That's, again, not the reason why we worry about the dummy variable trap. There's a specific mathematical relationship that we're trying to avoid, but I haven't talked to you at all about sort of the assumptions of, well, not in any serious way. I haven't really talked to you about the assumptions of OLS. So I'll leave it there. And that's it for this one. We don't have any of the x's inside of OLS1, and LM already takes care of this little epsilon for us. So we're okay here. Now we've got colonizer and geographic effects. Okay, so what's the model we're fitting? Well, again, we've got LN Madison GDP, PC GDP 2000. Okay, same variable, same exports over area. But what we've added here is we've added a bunch of x's. Okay, these x's were absolute latitude, so distance from the equator, longitude, where do you fall kind of left to right, west to east? What's the minimum rainfall, right? What's the max humidity? What's your average low temperature? And how much of your country is coastline? Well, why do we care about that? Well, again, all factors except longitude influence whether a country has a tropical climate, which affects the prevalence of infectious disease and agricultural productivity. Longitude is included to capture differences between the eastern and western parts of the African continent. Okay? And the claim here is in both specifications, the estimated relationship between slave exports and per capita income are negative and statistically significant. So we've already run our code. Let's see what it looks like. Summary OLS1, summary OLS2. The summary command is basically going to say, okay, I've got an object here, this OLS estimation that I did. Tell me some things about it. This is just a nice, so I mean, again, I can get all the information out of this, but this looks kind of ugly. So instead, just the facts, ma'am. Okay. So first of all, it repeats our model to us. We already know this. It's got some residuals listed here. We haven't really talked about residuals, but those are related to, those are kind of related to this epsilon here. We're going to get into this later, probably not tonight, but if you guys want, if we continue on with this, we'll, I'll be sure to address those. But what we particularly want to do is we want to see, did we get the same results as Nathan Nunn? Okay. So in this particular case, we don't have, we don't get to see the intercept. Okay. But we do get to see the coefficient. What do I mean by the coefficient? What I mean is, okay, so this is beta 0. In our version, beta 0 is 7.2153. Okay? Well, we don't know what Nathan Nunn got, so I can't really compare that. This is saying beta 1 is negative 0.1119. Okay? What did we say about whether or not this thing is negative? If this thing is negative, it means that slavery causes, or maybe doesn't cause, but slavery is related to decreased economic activity in the modern day. If this was positive, it would mean slavery is good for economic performance. In this case, it's negative. Is it the same negative that Nathan Nunn gets? Well, we get 0.112. Okay, well, 1119, round the 9 up, we get 1112. So this is actually a little different. I'm maybe a bit surprised by that because it should be doing the same thing, but like it's, for all intents and purposes, it's what it needs to. Oh, hang on, no, 112. Yeah, no, if we roll up, then we get 112. Sorry, I snuck in an extra one there. So we're okay there. Below is the standard error. So this is basically an estimate of what does the variance around this estimate look like. Remember those little bands that got printed when we did that that one graph? That's kind of this idea here. Similar idea, maybe not the exact same, but you can, there's a relationship that you can find between that. But more importantly, we've got an estimate. So, okay, well, he says he got 0.24. Well, we get 0.238. Well, 8 rounded up, 0.24, so that makes sense. It doesn't report p-values or anything like that, although the p-value is less than 1. So this is highly significant. In this particular case, 3 little stars indicates significance at the 1%. So the way that this works is there's a thing called a hypothesis test. And what you do is you take a look at sort of you look at a distribution and you say, okay, well, this is the sort of result, here's where a certain percentage of the results are going to fall. And what you kind of want is something that's really, really far out and is very unlikely to just fall into I just say a normal random pattern. Like basically, this is a way of looking at this, which is saying you found a result which isn't just noise. You have found something that is an underlying relationship in the data. Now, there's a lot of complaining that goes on about p-values, because I think it was R.A. Fisher who wrote that he has a general recommendation that you should sort of believe results that have a p-value of about 5, or basically a significance at the 5% value. And that has since kind of become gospel. You get published if you have significance at 5% or less, and you don't get published if you're significant above it. Doesn't matter if your p-value is, 0.05 or 5,000,001, and it doesn't matter if your result is 0.4999999. One of these papers gets published, the other one doesn't. And that's a totally arbitrary, basically a totally arbitrary distinction. So the best that I can say here is what you usually want to look for is across a few different specifications. If you've got a number here, which is explaining an economic relationship. In this case, we're talking about an economic relationship between the exports divided by area and GDP. This relationship is quite solid for this specification. And what we're going to do, as you can see inside here, it kind of keeps its 3 stars. It goes down to 2 here, but basically it sort of keeps its relationship, it keeps its significance sort of throughout. Okay. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't report the colony effect, so we're sort of left without that, although it does say it's included. You'll notice here that their p-values are usually quite high. There's one here which is at the 5% level. We'll see whether or not that sticks around. All that's really saying, let's imagine that did, and maybe that even got to a higher level of confidence or something like that. All that we'd really be saying about that would be, okay, well, basically, we've identified that, colony 5 was also an important effect, but once we've accounted for it, we've also captured this relationship between slave exports. So one thing you can think about what this experiment is doing here, or not experiment, but what this method is doing here is you're saying, it's like, okay, I am accounting for, I know a country's GDP in the year 2000. I know how many slaves it exported divided by the area, and I know who colonized it. So when I account for the colonization, do I still see this relationship that we saw in the graph? And the answer here is yes. Okay. The next thing we're going to say, well, what about this whole thing about whether or not you're in a tropical climate? Okay. It's all well and good. Okay. So we understand that even though we account for colonizers and that they have a negative impact on GDP, as it happens, actually, colony 5 is indicating that there's a positive effect. Who was colony 5? So apparently if you got colonized by the Spanish, you got better GDP in the modern age. I'm not sure I believe that, but now we've got OLS2, and we're going to say, okay, I will grant you that this is not explained solely by colonizer effects. But what about geography? Because I was pretty convinced when you told me, prevalence of infectious disease and agricultural productivity. What happens to the relationship then? Well, actually, there's one other thing. So there's a measure which is sometimes used as a goodness of fit. It's called the R-squared. We should actually be comparing all the things that he gets. So number of observations is just a way that we can sort of confirm that we had the right thing. I don't think it reports the number of observations offhand, but one thing I can say is that it's got 43 degrees of freedom. If you add these things back in, you get up to 52. So that's a relationship I happen to know. So just trust me on this one. But what about the R squared? So Nathan Nunn got 0.51. Does it actually report? I think multiple R squared is what it's looking for. If I round up, that's correct. We'll see if the other specification has it. Adjusted R squared is different. There's an important thing here. So a lot of, I think, sociology students, I tend to notice, talk to me a lot about R squareds. There's a problem with this, which is that mathematically, if you keep adding more variables, this number always goes up. You can always fit it a little bit better because the idea is you're getting more freedom, right? You have more little knobs to twist to sort of really make that line fit better. So every time you add something, your R squared is going to go up. That's why, like, you shouldn't just look at this and say, like, so this is kind of a measure of like how much is explained by your model. And different disciplines care. So like, you know, I think physicists would take a look at this as like significant at 1%. Jesus Christ. Like, I thought we were doing science here. And, you know, they look at that R squared, they're like, yeah, you haven't found anything. But we're dealing with humans, right? Humans are complicated, and it's hard to make them, like, humans don't always behave in sort of the same deterministic way that that particles do. And so for the social sciences, there's a certain leniency that's maybe given. So but what you kind of want to get away from this particular analysis here, so this estimate here translates to a number in this model. Okay, so you can think of this as the effect of that particular variable, whether it's the slave exports or whether it's the colonizer. And the standard error will talk to you about the variability of this observation. So for instance, when I have something like, oh, this is a good one. So colony 3, I've got 0.2108 as an effect, but the standard error is 0.5310. So I have no idea where this thing is going, right? It could be, you know, it could be bigger than 0. It could be smaller than 0. Like this is the estimate I got, but it could really be anything. Well, not anything, but like I have no idea whether or not I've captured a positive or negative effect. Most realistically, we probably haven't accounted. We have the specific wording that you want to take on this p-value basically is that we have insufficient evidence to reject the hypothesis that this estimate is 0. What we're usually looking to do is we're trying to set up this is a very shorthand way of setting up an experiment that says, okay, is this thing that we're interested in, do we have any evidence to believe that this is a number other than 0? And what this very small p-value says for this value here is we can say, yes, we have reported a number that is negative, and it is negative sort of consistently enough to say that we are quite confident. The preponderance of the evidence is such that this number is different from 0. And in this case, we see that the number is negative, and so we conclude that it's negative. So I belabored that point a little bit. But again, what happens when we start accounting for geography? One of the things that's important to notice here is, first of all, look at the magnitude. Okay, we've got 0.1119. Now we get 0.7616. It's a little bit weaker, which suggests that maybe maybe there was a little bit that was captured inside these things that we're now accounting for. But because we're doing a replication, we're interested in what Nathan Nunn's table says. So you got a 0.76 here. Well, again, we've got 1, so this matches up. Standard error of 0.29, so we're happy there. What about the distance from the equator or absolute latitude? Well, that's 0.16. So again, if we round up, we get that. And the standard error is 0.17. The monthly rainfall would be -1, which 001 actually. So rounding up, we get it. And we get a 0.5. So the standard error is a little bit different here. And I think it's because he's using robust standard errors. OLS estimates of 1 are reported. The dependent variable is the natural log of real capita per GDP in 2000. Slave export variable log slave exports of area is a natural log of total number of slaves exported from each country between 1400 and 1900. And the 4 slave trades normalized by land area. The colonizer fixed effects are the indicator variables for the identity of the colonizer at the time of independence. Coefficients are reported with standard errors in brackets. 3 stars, 2 stars, and 1 star indicate significance at the 1, 5, and 10% levels. Okay. So I guess that's just a regular standard error. So why, when I take, so rainfall min, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 7 by my estimate, and he gets 0, 0, 5. Nope, it's 0, 0, 7, and I was just reading the wrong line. Okay, we're good there. Max humidity, 0.009. Yep. And 12, so 17. Yep, okay. Low temperature, negative 0.19. Once we round up, that's that. And 0.28. Okay, so we're on the same page. Now, notice we should find 5% significance for coastline area. So we get 0.085, which is true once we round up. There's a way, by the way, you can set in R to report your estimates, maybe at a lower level of significance. I always like just going with the defaults because, you know, I'm not too bothered by it. I know how to round, and it also makes sure, like, when I make little mistakes like that, it makes sure that I'm actually paying attention to the data rather than saying, I trust you. So we've got a standard error of 0.39. And in this case, when we round up, we get it. And we can see a p-value of 0.035. It's lower than 0.5, so we know that that's true. And what does interest me, though, so we've got log export area. And this standard error is 0.0127, which means that that's actually significant at the 5% level, whereas he reports it significant at the 1% level. Now, you should be able to calculate that from the standard error. We got the same estimate, we got the same standard error, so we should have the same p-value. That's really interesting. I'm almost willing to make a guess that this might be misreported. I don't think he has his Stata code, but I don't have Stata on this computer. I only use that at work. So one thing, if you had access to Stata, now this is just the data set. Maybe he doesn't have his Stata. I mean, it says replication files on these other ones, but I guess it doesn't include, I guess this one doesn't actually include the, okay, interesting. I'd be kind of interested in running this thing in Stata and seeing whether or not it also reports some significance at the 5%. So here's the thing, right? So what did we really find here? It's like, oh, wait, it's significant at 5%, not 1%. It's like, okay, well, it's gotten a little bit weaker. I'd definitely be interested looking at these other, specifications here. But I mean, if the rule of thumb is that you care if that's significant at the 5% level, that's worthwhile. Also notice here, right, significant the p-value is 0.127, so it is definitely closer to 1 than anything. Now, obviously, you want to have a cutoff. You want to decide at the start what you consider to be a significant result. But I am not going to call the QJE and accuse them of fraud on the basis of saying that there's 3 stars where my replication says that there should be 2. But it is worth mentioning that this is a point where I say, well, here I didn't get the same result as the paper. It's not different in a substantial way, but it is different. As for the interpretation, I interpret the same way, though, right? There's a negative significant relationship between slavery and GDP. However, the magnitude of it seems to be reduced once we account for some of the geographic effects. So it seems like those things kind of mattered, and definitely the coastline mattered. Again, he did report some other values. So number of observations, 52. Notice the degrees of freedom went down. So that's a little bit more of an example where I was talking about if you just add in the number of variables that you had back into here, you've got your degrees of freedom. But I am interested in the R squared. So he reported 0.6. This is 0.6 here. I believe the adjusted R-square tries to deal with the question of whether or not your model is better fitting just because you added more variables. So in this case, the adjusted R-squared is still higher in this other model here. This is overall, this suggests that this is a better fit of the of sort of this slave data set to the real world. And of course, we've got the colonizer fixed effects. It looks like colony 5 is still significant. And actually, it's positive. The magnitude also seemed to go up. So apparently, it was just great to be colonized by Spain. I'm sure South America can back us up on that. But yeah, overall, you know, this is more or less reinforced our original finding about this relationship here. Now, I mean, you guys have already seen this table, so you know that we're going to do this 4 more times. And we're going to do it over various specifications. And in this case, you know that the significance is still going to hold. But is a difference in the results common? So Isaacson, in this particular case, no, it shouldn't be, because I'm using the exact same data that he is, and I'm using a very well-known estimation procedure known as OLS. However, I have run into some papers where it's very clearly that they put a typo. Like, intuitively, mathematically, like the relationship that they reported in that paper, it did not make sense for that number to be that number, but it was not important to their conclusion. So like, again, that's not the point where I call up the AER and I'm like, look, you scumbag, like there's no way that the F statistic was that. Unless like either you're doing what's called ordinary least squares estimation, which is what this procedure is. Either you're doing that or you're doing something else. Ordinary least squares estimation are the colonies referencing African colonies or any colony? So Uncle Elias, these are African countries colonized by other countries. So in this case, these are all African countries, but the colonizers will be usually European countries. I don't think there's any... well, I can get the list. So Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain. I still don't know what UN means. And Italy. So technically these are African colonies, but it's more the colonial origins is the idea. But yeah, so if you get a different result with OLS, it usually means you've either rounded differently or you've done something wrong. But I'd point out here, Isaacson, like just looking at this number here, like this could be anything from, so like all that we know, like we got the same standard error and we got the same coefficient. So for all I know, this is a typo that added one extra star by mistake. But again, like this is not the sort of thing I'm freaking out about. As long as we agree that 5% significance is sufficient, this still passes the test of significance. And more importantly, I'd say, you know, a p-value of 0.127. I mean, that's pretty darn close. I would maybe, so here's one thing that would cause me concern. If this number kept getting smaller over specifications and the significance started drifting away, then that's going to suggest to me that this effect is just capturing something that is being taken away as we add more controls. But in this case here, the result is pretty consistent. It's usually somewhere between 0.7576 and, you know, 0.12. That's kind of the range. So that's fairly consistent. And again, it remains significant throughout. So we can sort by I mean, the important thing here, it's not necessarily the number that we care about, but in this case, Uncle Elias, I believe we will see Equatorial Guinea. So apparently Morocco does not count as a Spanish colony here. What does it count as? This is a French colony. I have no idea, Uncle Elias. Yeah. I mean, one thing too, so we can go back to the paper for this. Where was it? So he explains his colony fixed effect. You know, I can probably just do a colon. Origin of the colonizer prior to independence. So I guess this would mean that when a country declares independence, whoever was so, you know, some epsilon minus the year of independence, whoever the colonizer was then is counts in that case. So that would be how I read that. But anyways, the biggest thing on that, like, you'll notice I'm a little blasé about some of these details, and it's just because in the end, like, we're accounting for colonizer effects, and what we found here, at least in terms of the specifications that we've used, we say in the end these results, except for the case of Spain, don't seem to have any effect. And the next thing we need to do is we'd say, it's like, okay, well, you just got the colonies all wrong. Then what we would need to say is like, okay, so let's throw out the colony fixed effects. You know, we'll maybe even come up with another specification. Let's try and come up with a reasoning that says that the results that we've got right now are biased because these colonizer fixed effects are wrong. There's certainly an argument to be made for that, but like in the end, if I was to challenge Nunn on his paper, I probably wouldn't go into too much of the minutia of the individual colonies. But yeah, basically the what this exercise is about is we're fitting values onto this beta number here. So here we got a 5.9 to put onto beta 0. Here we got negative 0.76 to put on this beta 1. And then for delta, we sort of took a collection of values, all positive, incidentally, on here. This doesn't mean they're significant. It just means that they're positive once we come up with our little black box that we put the number into. And then in terms of the geographic axes that we came up with, most of them were positive, but rainfall and minimum rainfall and low temperature had negative effects on GDP, although neither of them were significant. The only one that was significant would be the coastline divided by area. So in this case here, that's sort of what this, at least what this OLS portion is that, and the reason why we spend all this time reading the pages before is that what you want to do is you want to clearly state a relationship between what's known as your dependent variable, in this case our GDP per capita or log of GDP per capita, and we want to define independent variables, things that we think could affect or are important to our dependent variable. So what we've said here, log of GDP per capita, we say what we think is important for it is right now, the number of slaves divided by the area, taking the log of that for the country, who colonized it, and its geographic characteristics, namely its absolute distance from the equator, where it falls on east to west Africa, its minimum rainfall, its maximum humidity, what its average low temperature is, and basically how much of its area is coastline. And we've said we can explain, as long as, I guess the idea here is saying, as long as this adequately explains the major things that influence GDP, and anything else is kind of random noise, then we can identify what the effect of slavery is. And that also means if there's no effect of slavery, this number should be 0. Now, there's other things that we haven't accounted for yet. Okay, as a little bit of a preview, what are its natural resources, right? What's its diamond production per population or per person? What's its gold production per person? Oil production per person? Clearly, these natural resources are going to have an influence on a country's GDP. So if it just so happens that all of the countries that are doing poorly in the modern day are ones that don't have natural resources, and it also happens that they had lots of slaves, well, maybe we're just measuring the fact that they don't have a whole lot to sell and a whole lot to produce, and that's why they have a low GDP. Maybe slavery has nothing to do with it. And so we still need to answer questions like that. We've only accounted for geographic features. We haven't accounted for some of these other things. And so the reason why you read those chapters at the beginning is that unless you actually have a clear understanding of what you think this relationship is, what am I trying to test? How do I think the world works? What data do I have to ask this question? You're stumbling in the dark. And again, it's one thing for me to sit here and give you a whole bunch of numbers, but one of the things I've really been trying to, I'm going to guess you probably weren't here at the beginning, were you, Uncle Elias? Because we've covered a lot of this. The thing that we're looking for in this relationship is, the thing that we're looking for is, we're looking for, have a good night, Yorkshire Bastard. We're pretty much finishing up anyway. What we're looking to do is, I can give you a big list of numbers, but it's still our job to interpret it. Does it make sense? Does it sort of align with a consistent story that we've told about the world? One really important thing that we stressed a lot in the opening paragraphs were sort of the political effects, the fracturing of communities, and sort of this mistrust and sort of this conflict that was built inside of sort of this conflict that was coming as a result of the slave trade. Notice that none of that is included inside of our variables here. And so we want to include those factors before we do. But if we keep doing these individual specifications, we sort of get to develop our argument line by line. We get to see where these things go. So that's a really important thing. It's there's not a whole lot of R to learn in this, and I think if we do another session of this, I'll probably take this file and I'll put it up on the Discord channel. But the idea here is that, we only produce 28 lines of code out of this stream. But the important thing is that we understand why we did it, right? We say, this is the relationship that looks visual, just concerning, the two things we think are most important. We're now going to say, can we confirm this once we include things that we know are important to GDP? And we've done that in OLS 1 and OLS 2. If we continue to do this, we'll do this through basically the remaining 4 specifications, and we'll confirm that these results are the same. But the thing that's really interesting about this, and one of the reasons why I hope if you guys are interested, you'll see the next one, is we still haven't addressed the question of causality. Even when you do OLS and when you account for sort of these covariates, it's all well and good to say I have a whole bunch of controls, but all you've really identified is sort of a correlation between these two things. You've said that they move together in a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've identified a causal relationship. As Nathan Nunn sort of said at the beginning of the paper, well, maybe it just so happens that countries that were very poorly developed in the first place selected into the slave trade because they didn't have anything else to trade. And that's when we use another tool. So OLS, as it says here, OLS estimates show that there's a relationship between slave exports and current economic performance. It remains unclear whether the slave trades have a causal impact on current income. For that, we can't rely on OLS. What we need for that is a tool known as instrumental variables. And that's really where we move from things that you'd find in a standard statistics course into something that we would consider to resemble more as econometrics. And that's kind of where you get into the really interesting case of saying, it's like, no, we haven't just identified a correlation here. It's like, we know that slavery caused these countries to be worse off. If there was no slavery, then this country would have been better. And that's the exciting part for me when we go forward. So another thing to do here that is a more, I think maybe a more fundamental thing to point out is that I'm not going to say it's easy to pick this stuff up. I'm clearly taking a lot of, so I'm taking, it for granted that Nathan Nunn's data is correct. I don't have a way of interrogating whether or not his use of the historical data is justified. But I mean, you have to start somewhere, right? at this point, I am able, it's not just that I'm able to sort of get these numbers back, but I'm able to formulate, I am able to follow his argument and say, okay, I understand what you're doing here. Even if I wasn't given this table here, I would be able to follow the words that he said, and I would be able to put this inside of the program. Now notice, even when it comes to something simple like ggplot, I didn't know all of it, but I was able to use the help functions, and I was able to search online to say something like, how do, if I didn't know how to get these results, I could go onto Google and type, how do I do OLS in R? The really wonderful thing about R, and you don't have to use R, you can use Julia, you can use Python. R just happens to have a lot of work that's already done in terms of allowing you to do things that that people have already set up. There's also a special econometrics package. So if you don't know how to do instrumental variables, using matrices, and most don't, you can get that in the econometrics package on R. So there's a lot of smart people who've already written some programs for you to do. So what you can focus on is following the logic of the argument. You can verify the results, and then maybe you want to take this in a different direction. My undergraduate thesis was taking a paper that was not too dissimilar from this. It was a political science paper, but I attached it to a new data set, and I got a much more interesting result out of that. So as long as you're sort of, I would encourage you guys, find a topic that you're interested in, and, take a paper, see if you can poke at it, see if you can find the data and do this yourself. It's hard at the start, but this is a great little exercise to do, because one, you will understand that paper better. I'm hoping that, I will convince you that this is not just some guy trying to get tenure, but it's, but this is a way of looking at the world that will tell you something important. And again, you've got a big takeaway of saying that you have the hard, thinking work ahead of you. It's like, what do I know about the world? What do I think is important? We talk about colonizer effects. Why haven't we talked about the slave trade? We started off in this one saying that the slave trade lasted 500 years. Colonization lasted 75 years, well, in terms of the effects that they talk about in these papers. Clearly, if we're talking about duration, then it would seem that slavery has a bigger import. All of that stuff happened at the beginning before we even touched any code. And what you want to do is you want to form hypotheses about the world, and then you want to come up with a rigorous way of testing them. I should clarify what colonization did not just last 75 years. The specific things he was talking about in terms of things that affect GDP lasted for 75 years. But yeah, clearly slavery has been there for a longer time. He comes up with a convincing story that says, this is why I think slavery is important. But telling a story it doesn't pass what I'll call the Big Lebowski test, which is, what does Nathan Nunn do when somebody sits back and says, well, that's just your opinion, man? For that, we go to the data, and for that, we go to statistical models. And your next level of sophistication will be to say, was that the appropriate model to use, right? Even Nathan Nunn does this saying, it's look, OLS is one thing, but that doesn't identify a causal relationship. To do, I hope I've, convinced you up to this point. Now I'm going to slam the point home, and I'm going to use instrumental variables to demonstrate to you that this is not just, two things moving at the same time, but one of these things caused the other. And to me, that's where you get, where it gets really exciting. And then, maybe you learn more econometrics and you can say, oh, but there's your instruments are weak and, you have to do this specification instead. Or maybe you don't like instruments at all. Maybe you're going to do some other, analysis. Again, it's a big, long conversation, and it's a way of looking at the world. And the thing that I love, it's the blend between the creative side of you, which is to say, I think the world works this way. Hey, what if, what if we shut down the stock markets for all the countries, right? Nobody's going to let you do that in the real world. That would be a disaster. But then you use econometrics, and then you're able to say, oh, well, what if? What kind of an experiment can I imagine? Is there a way that I can see this in data? Maybe there was a day that there was a power out. What happened on that day? Is there a way that I can maybe, test this? What happens in countries that don't have stock markets? What happens when they get a stock market? Maybe there are certain features of countries that have stock market, when they move over to having a stock market, that indicates something about their well-being that has nothing to do with the stock market. That's just unrelated. There's all sorts of these little questions that you can ask, and these things give you a framework of thinking about them. And then you get to play make-believe. And that's the wonderful thing, right? You throw data at the problem, you test hypotheses, and you get to find out, you get to run these sort of counterfactuals and things like that sometimes. And you get to sort of say, what would have happened if X happened instead of Y. So, but yeah, I think that. Sorry, I'm catching everybody's messages. I'll maybe just say one quick thing. The Eyes of Sin. It is worth mentioning that I went to school for this. So 4 years of undergrad, then a year of graduate school. So I've had 5 years of swimming in this sort of stuff. So I know I failed to try and explain some things well. I'm going to go back and I'm going to think again about how I explain certain ideas. Like the importance of taking the logarithm to me is a fairly important. Actually, you know what? This isn't going to be an interesting experiment for us to do. What happens if I change these variables? So let me just see. I think exp should do this. So let me just say xp1. Cool. Okay. So we're going to do extra innings. So ave data GDP cap equals, oh no, gotta use the arrow. It'll work both ways, but this is the proper one. So exp ln Madison PC GDP 2000. So here I'm actually getting, what I'm doing here is I'm getting rid of the, god damn it. I'm undoing the logarithm is what I'm basically, I did it wrong. Slave data, there we go. I'm gonna do the same thing for export area. And export, okay. All right, so let's do these things, A, B. So everything else is the same. All that I've done here is I've removed the logarithm. So summary LSA. All right, so the numbers have gotten bigger. Interesting. So our export area loses its significance. In both cases. I'm gonna need to think about this for a little bit. So I'm just trying to think, like, I know, like, I take that as like a standard thing to do, to take the log of those. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that Nathan Nunn did this paper, but I'm just trying to think, how would I justify to you if you say, I think you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes by doing these fancy logarithm things. I'm just trying to think how I would justify that to you if you were like a really skeptical audience. A really skeptical audience that wasn't familiar with the math, and I don't think I can do this in the time that I have left, so. Yeah, well, see, this is the important thing too, Eyes of Sin. Like, so in terms of like, anybody who didn't do well in algebra is going to look at like the Greek letters and just say, oh my God, like I'm never going to get this. But like, again, when you piece it out, you're saying it's like, here's GDP. GDP is equal to some like baseline number. Some, slavery is going to affect GDP in some way. Colonization is going to affect it in some way. Geography is going to affect it in some way. And it was like, well, I don't know what those some ways are. Well, now you use the magic of OLS and it's going to tell you what these things are. Now, again, you don't want to say use the magic of OLS because that's where the important thing comes in, right? Like you need to understand why it makes sense to use this method. I don't think I really explained that particularly well, to be completely honest with you. But the idea here is like this equation is not just because we want to talk about math a lot. This equation is because we're saying this is how we think the world represents, we think this is a reasonable representation of how the world works, and we are now going to fit this to the data and see whether or not it explains what we see when we map this particular relationship. So, and again, like, not everybody, I mean, I didn't know any of this stuff. I had like grade 11 math when I went into university. I had to do a bunch of upgrading, and then it was hard when I started, but once I sort of learned that I would be able to do projects like this, that really motivated me to brush up my math. And as you can see, I still make little mistakes. There's still some things which are gaps in my understanding, and I don't feel confident like holding forth on, for you guys. That's why I'm leaving some of that for another stream. But one way you get better is doing little projects like this and seeing if you can learn, like I said, I learned new things about ggplot this time around. And I also learned that I need to do a better job of justifying the choice to take logs. I mean, to me, it's about the shape of the relationship. So if you take away the log, I can't guarantee you that this relationship is linear anymore. And I think that's why we see these problems. But actually, you know what? There's one other thing I can do. I think this will give you a perfect example of why you need to take those logs. Let's do our Ggplot again. And let's fit that to our I think this plot will tell us a lot. All right, so see that? It's not really a linear relationship. So the log is a way to transform it into a relationship that actually fits the assumptions of OLS. So anyways, still probably not the most convincing argument that I can make for it, but I think we've definitely, we've run our course. I'm a little tired. And I also think at this point, like, I'd be cool. I think to justify being in the creative channel, I would need to do some more programming on this. And I don't think I can do justice to the rest of the paper in the time that I have left. So I'll find somebody to host. But before I head off, would you guys be interested in seeing the rest of this paper another time? Because if you are, I will be happy to do it again. Yeah, not a problem, Isaacson. It was definitely nice to have the encouraging words. Okay, cool. So Isaacson and Uncle, I think you're the only two active in chat right now, but I will keep that in mind. I can't guarantee you when, because I think on Friday I really do want to finish The Walking Dead. My cough seems to be away, which is kind of nice, but just a quick repeat for those of you who came in. What we were doing here was replicating a paper by Nathan Nunn. So we're using R, the Microsoft R Open, although you can do it with either one. You can go to his website, so scholar.harvard.edu/none/home. The data set that we are using is in the data section for the long-term effects of Africa's slave trades. You will need the Haven package if you want to open it up. And hey, not a problem, Kite. I hope you found it interesting. No, honestly, guys, like questions are important. Like, so it's one thing. It's masturbation if I just like do this in silence, right? I mean, this is just me learning a thing or two about Ggplot then. But it's important for me to be able to explain. So if you guys have a question saying like, I don't believe you when you say X. Why is X the case? How do I know that X is the case? I should be able to answer that for you. And if I can't answer that, then that means that there's a gap in my own understanding that I should be addressing. So questions are important. Just because I sound confident when I say this stuff, it doesn't mean that that I should just be taken as an authority. But yeah, anyway, so if you guys want to follow along, I will be posting this stuff in my Discord when we finish it. So that'll be after the second stream that we do. And yeah, but you can follow along on the VOD. And if you want to access his paper, just go to his Harvard website to get the paper. Was the 2008 QJE, The Long-Term Effects of Africa's Slave Trades. So I think I will host someone tonight. And Shane O'Mad was who I was hosting before, so I will host him again. You don't need to say the raid message, but I will give a shout out here. There we go. And I'm just going to get some sleep. So I will see you guys on Friday. Thanks a lot for hanging out.